He rode into Dry Mercy's main square at 5:30 in the morning, before the decent people were fully awake, before the light was good enough to see faces clearly. That was the point. He wanted witnesses, not observers. He wanted people who were still half asleep, still pulling on their boots, still too foggy and frightened to think clearly about what they were seeing. The wagon was already there. He'd had his men bring it in after midnight. Eliza Harland was standing on it. She wasn't crying. He'd expected that, and the fact that she wasn't irritated him in a way he didn't show. Her wrists were bound behind her back. Her ankles were hobbled with a short rope so she couldn't jump or kick. The noose hung around her neck like something that belonged there, like it had been made specifically for her. And Harlan Strake sat on his horse at the edge of the square and watched the crowd gather and felt nothing except a mild, satisfied impatience. "Get it done before the heat comes up," he told the vigilante standing nearest the wagon wheel. The man nodded and reached for the harness. If you've ever felt your blood run cold, watching something happen that you couldn't stop, if you've ever stood in a crowd and known that what you were seeing was wrong and done nothing anyway, because you were afraid, then you already understand what the people of Dry Mercy felt that morning. And if a story like that deserves to be heard, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story travels. Because what happened next in Dry Mercy is the kind of thing people are still talking about, and you will not want to miss a single part of it. The wagon had been built for hauling silver ore. It was heavy, solid, reinforced along the floor with iron strapping, because ordinary wood couldn't take the weight of full ore crates without cracking. Harlan Strake had chosen it deliberately. The extra weight made it harder to tip, harder to overturn by accident, harder to disrupt. He thought of everything. Eliza Harland stood on it with her chin up and her jaw set and her eyes fixed on some middle distance that wasn't the crowd and wasn't Harlan Strake and wasn't the rope around her neck. She was 30 years old, and she weighed close to 250 pounds, and she was wearing the same gray dress she'd been wearing when they dragged her out of the house 3 hours before dawn. And there was a small cut above her left eyebrow, where one of the men had shoved her headfirst into the doorframe, getting her out. She hadn't said a word since they put the noose on her. Not because she had nothing to say. She had a great deal to say. She simply understood that saying it now, here, to these men, would accomplish nothing except giving Harlan Strake the entertainment of watching her beg. She wasn't going to do that. She'd made that decision somewhere around the 3rd hour of the night. While they had her sitting on the floor of the jailhouse, with her hands tied, and no lamp and no blanket, and the kind of cold that gets into your joints and makes every bone feel like it's being squeezed in a vice. She'd made herself focus. She'd gone through everything she knew. Every name, every date, every number she'd copied from the ledgers she wasn't supposed to have seen. Every conversation she'd committed to memory, because she'd understood, even then, that she might need it, and that nobody was going to believe her unless she had facts they couldn't argue with. She'd spent 4 months building a case. She just needed to survive the next hour. The crowd in the square numbered maybe 60 people. Most of them had been woken by the noise of Strake's men moving the wagon into position. A few were still in their nightclothes with coats thrown over the top. The merchant from the dry goods store was there, a heavy-set man named Olin Pitts, who'd always been cordial to Eliza at the counter and was now standing at the far edge of the crowd looking at his boots. The school teacher, a thin woman named Mrs. Craddock, was there with her hands clasped in front of her and her face completely white. 2 men from the livery, the woman who ran the laundry. Several miners still smelling of yesterday's rock dust. Not one of them moved toward the wagon. Eliza understood that too. She didn't blame them. Harlan Strake owned the bank that held most of their mortgages. He controlled the freight road that carried their goods. His name was on 3 of the 5 buildings, most essential to the town's survival. Any one of them who stepped forward right now would find themselves in a very similar position before the week was out. That was how Strake worked. That was how he'd held this town for 11 years. The vigilante nearest the wagon wheel, a thick-necked man named Cord Fulser, who served as Strake's personal enforcer, put his hand on the trace and looked up at his employer for the signal. Strake raised one finger. That was when the sound started. It came from the north end of the square, from the direction of the freight road, the sound of hooves at a full gallop, the kind of riding that meant either panic or purpose. And the crowd turned to look, because any distraction from what was about to happen was something the crowd desperately wanted. The rider came over the low ridge at the north end of town and didn't slow down. He was on a gray horse that looked like it hadn't been properly rested in 2 days, all dark sweat and heaving ribs. And the man on its back was riding with the kind of focused efficiency that said he knew exactly where he was going and had no interest in being polite about getting there. He was tall in the saddle, lean in a way that had more to do with hard years than any particular discipline, and he looked like he was somewhere in his late 30s. His coat was road-dusted, and his hat was the kind that had seen enough weather to forget what color it had started as, and there was nothing particularly remarkable about him at first glance except the way he rode straight-backed. Economical, with both hands where you could see them. He pulled the horse up at the edge of the square in a shower of loose dirt. His eyes went immediately to the wagon, to Eliza, to the noose. Then to Cord Fulser's hand on the trace. "Hold," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Cord Fulser turned around slowly, the way men turn around when they want to make clear they aren't startled. "Move along, stranger. Town business." "That's not town business," the rider said. "That's a hanging. Same thing. Only in a town that's lost its mind." He stepped the horse forward 3 paces, just enough to put himself between the wagon and the clearest line of exit. "What's the charge?" Strake turned his horse to face the newcomer. He took his time doing it. He was a big man, Strake not tall but broad, with a face that had been handsome 20 years ago and had since been overtaken by the particular look of a man who'd gotten everything he'd ever wanted and found it made him meaner rather than satisfied. He was 52 years old, and he'd spent most of those years in the sun, and none of them in doubt about his own importance. "Theft," Strake said. "Payroll silver, and you'd be wise to mind your own concerns." "Theft." The rider looked at Eliza again. She looked back at him with an expression that revealed nothing. "You're hanging a woman for theft. Frontier law is what it is. Frontier law has a trial. Frontier law has a judge." The rider settled back in his saddle very slightly, the way a man settles when he's committing to staying. "I don't see either of those things." Cord Fulser stepped away from the wagon wheel and put his hand on his revolver. He was flanked almost immediately by 4 other men, spreading out in a loose, practiced semicircle, the kind of positioning that told anyone watching these were not hired ranch hands who'd stumbled into a confrontation. These were men who'd done this before. The rider looked at the 5 of them. There was a pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds. "If they do that," the rider said, "we're going to need 5 coffins." Nobody laughed. Cord Fulser's jaw tightened. The men on either side of him exchanged a glance. Harlan Strake sat on his horse and studied the stranger with narrowed eyes, doing the kind of rapid calculation that successful men get good at: threat assessment, resource counting, reading the odds. What Strake saw was a single tired man on a blown horse, outnumbered 5-1, with a square full of witnesses who weren't going to help him. What Strake missed was the way the man's hands were resting. Not on his revolver, not telegraphing any kind of draw. Just sitting there, loose and easy, the way hands sit when their owner has already decided exactly what he's going to do and is simply waiting for the moment. "You're a long way from having any business here," Strake said. "Brenner Vane," the rider said. "I've got a letter from Caleb Harland. He asked me to come." Something moved through the crowd. Not sound more like a shift in pressure, the collective held breath of 60 people who'd just heard the name of a dead man spoken out loud by someone who apparently hadn't gotten the message that Caleb Harland's business was finished. Eliza Harland's chin came up another fraction of an inch. She knew that name. Caleb had written that letter 8 months ago, before things got bad. Before Strake figured out what Caleb had found. She hadn't known if the letter ever reached anyone. She'd been afraid to ask. And then Caleb was dead, and she had more immediate things to be afraid of, and she'd told herself that whoever Caleb had written to was either too far away to help or too smart to try. Brenner Vane was apparently neither. Cord Fulser took 2 steps toward the horse. "Hand over the letter." "No, I'm not asking twice. I heard you the first time." Vane's eyes went past Fulser to the wagon, to the trace. to the harness connecting the wagon to the team of 2 horses standing in front of it. He was measuring something. Eliza could see him doing it, though she couldn't have said how she knew. "The woman gets down," he said. "Then we talk." "The woman hangs," Strake said flatly. "And then you leave. Those are the only terms being offered." Vane looked at him for a moment. Then he reached inside his coat. Every man in Strake's group went for iron. Vane's hand came out with a folded piece of paper. He held it up so they could see it wasn't a weapon. "Caleb Harlan's letter," he said. "You want it. You take her down first." "Shoot him," Strake said. Vane shot first, not at the men. Not at Strake. He put 1 round directly into the front left trace of the wagon harness, the heavy leather strap, connecting the left-led horse to the wagon tongue. The shot was close enough, and accurate enough, that the strap separated cleanly, and the left horse, startled and suddenly unbalanced, lurched sideways and dragged the right horse with it. The wagon tongue twisted. The wagon itself jolted hard to the right. Not enough to tip it, enough to rock it, enough to throw Cordfulser sideways when he'd been in the middle of his draw. Vane was off his horse before the echo of the shot finished. He came in fast and low, and the thing about a man who'd spent 11 years tracking dangerous fugitives across the frontier was that he'd learned the hard way that speed and positioning beat aim at close quarters more often than not. He got inside Fulser's reach before Fulser had his balance back, got hold of the gun wrist and twisted, and the revolver hit the dirt. The second man came at him from the left, and Vane caught the gun barrel with his forearm on the way up, redirected the muzzle toward the sky, and hit the man once, hard, just below the ear with the heel of his palm. The man went down. The third man hesitated. That was enough. Vane turned to face him with Fulser's revolver in his right hand, and his own revolver still in its holster, and the kind of expression on his face that communicated very clearly that the pause in violence was available but would not last long. "4 coffins now," he said, "or nobody needs any." "Your choice." The third man stepped back, so did the fourth. The fifth had drifted 2 steps sideways during the chaos, trying to get an angle, and he stopped drifting when he realized that Vane had noticed and had adjusted accordingly. Harlan Strake sat on his horse and watched this with controlled fury. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Vane agreed. "It isn't." He turned to the wagon, keeping the revolver loosely at his side. "Ma'am, you want to come down from there?" Eliza looked at him. She had a rope around her neck, her wrists bound, her ankles hobbled, and she was standing on a wagon that had just lurched sideways, hard enough to nearly throw her off. And she looked at this stranger who'd ridden in out of nowhere and shot a harness trace and knocked 2 armed men down, and was now asking if she'd like to come down from the wagon as if he were, offering to help her out of a carriage at a church social. "Yes," she said, "I would." Getting her off the wagon took some doing. The noose came off first. Vane had to climb up to reach it, and he did it with the practical focus of a man who was also keeping one eye on Strake's remaining men and the other on Strake himself. The hobbles on her ankles he cut with a folding knife from his coat pocket. The rope on her wrists took a minute because it had been tied tight, and the knot had cinched down further when she'd involuntarily braced against the wagon's jolt. He didn't say anything while he worked. She didn't either. The crowd watched. Strake watched. When her hands were free, Eliza reached up and rubbed her wrists and took 1 full breath, and then she looked at Brenner Vane at close range for the first time. He was older than she'd first thought. Not in a bad way, in the way that a man gets older, when he's been paying attention to difficult things for a long time. There were lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind. His hands were calloused in specific places that told you he worked with them regularly. He had a jaw that hadn't been shaved in 3 days, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow greenish-gray, very still, the kind of eyes that didn't give much away. "Caleb wrote you," she said, "about 8 months back. It took you this long to get here. I was in Utah," he met her gaze. "I came as fast as the roads would let me." Something in his voice made her believe that. She didn't know why. She didn't know this man at all. But there was something in the flatness of it, the lack of apology or performance, that struck her as the voice of someone who wasn't particularly interested in how things looked. "He's dead," she said, "Caleb." A pause. "I'm sorry." She nodded once. She'd been done crying about that. She had other things to do now. Harlan Strake hadn't moved from his horse. He was watching the exchange between Vane and Eliza with an expression that had passed through fury and come out the other side into something colder and more dangerous. Fury was reactive. What was on Strake's face now was the look of a man doing long-term calculations. "I'll give you until noon," Strake said. "Vane, is it? By noon you hand me that letter and you ride out of dry mercy." "The woman is still facing charges." "No, she isn't," Vane said. "I control this county. You control a corrupt sheriff and 6 hired men, one of whom is currently sitting in the dirt. And this," Vane looked around at the crowd, "is a lot of witnesses to a lot of things this morning. So we'll table the charges conversation." Strake's horse shifted under him. "You don't know this town. I know enough." He looked back at Eliza. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" She looked at the crowd. At the faces, some frightened, some carefully blank, one or two with something that might have been relief in them, if they dared to let it show. She looked at her house at the end of the street. Strake's men had already been through it twice. It wasn't safe. "Caleb had an office above the freight office," she said. "Strake's men searched it 2 months ago. They think they cleared it out." "Did they?" "No." Vane almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. More like a small shift around the eyes. "Lead the way." They walked across the square together, the heavy-set widow and the road-dusted stranger, and the crowd parted for them, the way crowds part when something has happened that nobody quite understands yet, but everyone can feel the weight of. Harlan Strake watched them go. His jaw was tight. The finger that had been raised to signal Fulser was now curled into his palm. "Follow them," he said quietly. "Don't let them out of sight." Cord Fulser, still sitting in the dirt and working his jaw carefully to make sure it wasn't broken, looked up at his employer. "And if Vane sees us?" Strake turned his horse toward the main road. "Then be better at your job." The office above the freight company was small and smelled like old paper and dried mud and the particular dusty sweetness of spaces that haven't been opened in a while. Caleb Harlan's name was still on the door in faded letters. Nobody had bothered to take it down. Eliza didn't know if that was carelessness or some kind of deliberate cruelty, Strake leaving the name up as a reminder. She pushed the door open and went in first. The room had been cleared, the shelves stripped, the drawers pulled out, papers scattered and left. Strake's men had been thorough. They'd taken everything they could see. They hadn't looked behind the wall panel. Eliza went to the far corner, to a section of wainscoting that looked exactly like every other section of wainscoting in the room, and pressed in the right spot. The panel moved. Behind it was a narrow space about 2 inches deep and 16 inches wide, just large enough to hold a flat bundle of papers folded together and wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it out and handed it to Vane. He unwrapped it carefully. Sat down in the one remaining chair, a 3-legged thing missing most of its back, and read without speaking for several minutes. Eliza stood by the single window and watched the street below. She could see 2 of Strake's men near the entrance to the alley that ran alongside the building. They weren't trying to be subtle about it. "Your husband was careful," Vane said finally. "Yes. He's got names here. Dates. Cross-referenced against freight shipments." He flipped to the 3rd page. "This isn't just evidence of land fraud. This is enough to put Strake away for a very long time." "I know." Eliza kept her eyes on the street. "Why do you think they killed him?" Vane set the papers down on his knee. "He mention anyone to you? Someone who could corroborate this? A witness or a minor?" "Silas Quill," she said. "Surveyor. Retired. He helped Caleb document some of the fraudulent boundary claims the one Strake used to force people off their land." She turned away from the window. "Caleb trusted him. Said he was the only person who'd seen enough of Strake's operation to explain the numbers to someone who didn't know the land. Where is he? That's the problem." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, a gesture that had nothing to do with temperature. "I haven't been able to reach him in 3 weeks. He lives in the foothills, about 4 miles out. I've sent 2 messages, no reply." Vane was quiet for a moment. Could be he heard what happened to Caleb. Could be. She looked at him directly. Or Strake found out about him. "You think Strake knows about Quill?" "I think Harlan Strake finds out about most things eventually. He didn't build what he's built in this county by missing details." She hesitated, then said the thing she'd been thinking since the moment she recognized who Vane was. "The letter Caleb sent you, what exactly did it say?" Vane reached into his coat and took out the folded paper she'd seen him hold up in the square. He handed it to her. She recognized the handwriting immediately and had to take a breath before she could read it. Brenner, I know it's been years. I'm not writing to catch up. I found something here in Dry Mercy that goes deeper than one man's greed. Land fraud, murder, corruption from the county seat down to the local badge. I can't take it to the federal authorities alone. I don't have enough yet, and I don't trust who's been bought. I need someone I trust to hold what I find in case something happens to me. If you get this letter and haven't heard from me in 6 months, come anyway. There's a woman here, my wife Eliza. She knows more than she lets on. She always has. If I'm not there when you arrive, help her. She'll know what to do, Caleb. Eliza folded the letter carefully. She didn't trust herself to speak immediately. Caleb had known. He'd known something was coming for him, and he'd still worked. Still documented, still cross-referenced, still wrapped the oilcloth bundle and pressed it behind the wall panel and written letters to men he trusted. He'd kept working until they stopped him. He was a good man, Vane said quietly. The best I knew, she said. She handed the letter back. He also always said I was stubborn to the point of being difficult. Was he wrong? Something that was almost a smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. No, frequently not. She looked at the oilcloth bundle on Vane's knee. We need to find Silas Quill. We do, Vane agreed. Today, he looked up. You want to go now? Strake knows you're here. He knows you have the letter. Every hour we wait, he's making plans. She moved toward the door. He had over a decade to build what he's built. We have maybe days before he figures out a way to bury what Caleb found, whatever's left of it, and disappear somewhere we can't reach him. Vane stood, tucked the oilcloth bundle inside his coat. You know the way to Quill's cabin? Caleb took me once. About 2 years ago. She opened the door, then stopped. Turned back, Mr. Vane Brenner. She looked at him. You came a very long way on the strength of a letter from a dead man. He wasn't dead when he wrote it. No, but he's been dead 6 months. You still came. Vane met her eyes. There was something steady in them, not warm exactly, but solid in the way that certain things are solid, the kind of steadiness that doesn't perform itself. We were friends a long time, he said. The kind of friends where the debt doesn't expire. Eliza held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and walked down the stairs, and Brenner Vane followed, and neither of them looked at the two men Strake had posted at the alley entrance as they went out through the back. They rode north and slightly west, out of town along the freight road, and then off it onto the packed earth track that wound up into the foothills. Vane's gray horse was laboring more than it should have been, 2 days of hard riding, with not enough rest, and Eliza was on a sorrel mare she'd kept stabled at the livery because Strake's men had already taken the horse she'd had at the house. The morning was cooling down from its early warmth. Autumn in Arizona had a particular quality of light, very clear, very pale, the kind of light that didn't hide things. Eliza rode without speaking for the first mile. She was thinking. Vane led her. Strake will send men after us, she said finally. Already sent, Vane said. 2 of them picked us up leaving town. They're about a half-mile back. Eliza turned to look. She couldn't see them. You can see that far? No. But they followed us out the freight road, and there's one place on that road where the dust hangs different. 2 horses maybe 5 minutes behind. He kept his eyes forward. They're not trying to stop us. Not yet. They want to see where we go. To Quill. That would be my guess. She thought about that. We should lose them. We should, he agreed. You know this terrain? Some of it. Caleb surveyed a lot of this land himself before Strake bought out most of the survey office. She looked at the scrub-covered hillside to their left. There's a dry creek bed about 3/4 of a mile up. It cuts east. If we take it, we come out behind the ridge instead of over it. Quill's cabin is on the north face. How deep is the bed? Deep enough for horses if we dismount and lead them. Vane nodded. Lead the way. They found the creek bed where Eliza remembered it, a sandy-floored cut about 8 feet deep running roughly east through the hillside, with scrub juniper growing thick on both banks. They walked the horses down into it, and the depth and the vegetation swallowed the sound of their passage fairly effectively. Eliza was better in the terrain than Vane expected. She moved without hesitation, choosing the firmer sections of the creek bed, avoiding the spots where the sand was too soft, and would slow the horses down. She was careful with her footing in a way that spoke of someone who'd done a fair amount of walking in rough country, regardless of what anyone looking at her might have assumed. He didn't say anything about it. It wasn't worth commenting on. She knew the terrain. He didn't. Simple enough. They came out the other side of the ridge in roughly 40 minutes and began the descent to the north face. The cabin was visible from the ridge line, a small structure, solidly built, with a smoke-blackened chimney and a single window facing south, and a covered lean-to against the east wall where Quill presumably kept tools and wood. The door was open, not ajar. Open, pulled back flat against the exterior wall, as if someone had left in a hurry or had been taken in a hurry. Eliza stopped her horse. Vane stopped his. They sat for a moment listening. Birds, wind in the scrub, the horses breathing, nothing else. "How long has it been since you sent the last message?" Vane asked. 10 days. He studied the cabin, the open door, the lean-to which from this distance appeared undisturbed. "Stay here." "No." He looked at her. "I'm done staying places while other people walk into danger," she said. Her voice was even. Not defiant, just clear, the way facts are clear. "We go together or I follow you anyway." Vane considered arguing. Decided against it. "Stay close and stay behind me until I know what we're walking into." They rode down. The cabin was empty. More than empty, it had the particular blankness of a space from which someone has removed the things that make it a home. Silas Quill's tools were gone from the lean-to. His coat hooks were bare. The small table near the window still had a coffee mug on it, cold, dregs dried to a dark ring at the bottom, and a half-eaten plate of beans that had been sitting long enough to grow a thin gray skin. Eliza touched the side of the coffee pot on the stove. "Cold. Long cold. He's been gone at least 4 days," she said. Vane crouched near the door. The ground outside was soft enough to hold prints, multiple sets, overlapping. He worked through them carefully. 3 horses, different weights. They came from the east and they left the same way. Strake's men, most likely. He stood. They weren't rough about it. No sign of struggle inside. Either Quill went willingly or they didn't give him a chance to resist before they had control of the situation. Eliza stood in the center of the empty cabin and felt something she hadn't let herself feel all morning, the cold pull of real fear, not of dying, which she'd already more or less made peace with at the wagon, but of failing. Of having gotten this far, survived this morning, found Caleb's papers, found Brenner Vane, and still coming up short because Strake had moved faster. Then she looked down. Near the base of the stove, half tucked under the edge of the floor mat, was a small piece of paper. Someone had pushed it there, deliberately not dropped it, pushed it. So it was hidden, but not too hidden, findable by someone who looked. She picked it up. 3 words in an old man's shaky handwriting, and a set of initials. Black Canyon, Stage Station SQ. She held it out to Vane. He read it. Read it again. He knew they were coming, Vane said. Or he heard something, and had enough time to leave a message. Either way, he's telling us where he is. Vane folded the paper and put it in his coat. Black Canyon Stage Station, you know it? I know where it is. She thought about the terrain. It's abandoned. Has been for 6-7 years. It's in a box canyon about 12 miles south of here. Defensible position, Vane said, for whoever's holding him. The word hanging in the air between them was not said. Eliza said it anyway. Strake's going to use him to bargain. Yes. He'll offer a trade. Quill for the letter. Yes. Vane looked at her, and that's a trade I can't make. Even if I wanted to, because Strake will burn the evidence the minute he has the letter, and Quill is still the only person alive who can explain what the numbers mean to a judge. I know. She pulled her shawl straight. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. So we need another plan. Vane looked at the paper. At the cabin. At Eliza. We'll need to think carefully, he said. We have 12 miles, she said. Start thinking. They walked out of the empty cabin into the pale Arizona light, and behind them the coffee mug sat on the table with its dried ring of cold dregs, and the half-eaten plate sat with its thin gray skin, and somewhere 12 miles south in a box canyon. An old surveyor was waiting to find out whether anyone had found his message in time. The fresh hoof prints in the soft ground outside the door ran east toward Black Canyon, and Brenner Vane studied them for a long moment before he turned and followed Eliza Harland to the horses. The hoofprints ran east, and Brenner Vane spent longer looking at them than Eliza thought was necessary until she realized he wasn't just reading the prints, he was reading the spacing, the depth, the way the dirt had been disturbed at the edges of each impression. He was figuring out how long ago the horses had left and how fast they'd been moving. 4 days, maybe 5, he said finally. They weren't in a hurry when they left. That means they weren't worried about being followed. That means Strake didn't think anyone would find this place and know what they were looking at. He turned from the prints and went to his horse. They still don't know about the note. Eliza tucked that thought away. It was the first real advantage they'd had all day, and she wasn't going to waste it by saying it out loud too many times. They rode south. The terrain between Quill's cabin and Black Canyon was the kind of country that looked passable from a distance and punished you for believing it up close. The foothills dropped into a series of shallow ravines running crosswise to their path, each one requiring them to find a way down, and then a way up the opposite side. And the soil in the ravines was loose and unreliable in a way that made the horses nervous and slow. Eliza's sorrel mare planted her feet twice and refused to move until Eliza dismounted, took the reins, and walked her through. She did it without complaint both times. It added 20 minutes to the ride. Vane didn't say anything. He just waited and then rode on when she was mounted again. "You're not what I expected," he said, somewhere in the second hour of riding. She glanced at him. "What did you expect?" "Caleb's letter said you knew more than you let on." He kept his eyes on the terrain ahead. "I expected a cautious woman, someone holding information back because she was frightened or uncertain. And instead, you're holding information back because you're calculating." She thought about denying it, decided that was pointless. "Caleb always said I thought like a surveyor. I like to know where things are before I start moving them." "What are you still holding back?" She looked at him directly. He was watching the ridge line to the east with more attention than he'd been giving it a few minutes before. He'd seen something movement, maybe, or the absence of something that had been there. She resisted the urge to turn and look herself. "Caleb didn't just keep one record," she said. "The oilcloth bundle is the clearest set, but before he died, he told me he'd made copies. Not complete copies, different pieces. Parts of the evidence distributed to different people." Vane was quiet. He was careful, she said. He knew if Strake took him and found the main bundle, there would still be other pieces out there. Strake could suppress one location. He couldn't suppress all of them without knowing what they were or where they were. "Does Strake know about the copies?" "I don't think so. I think he believes the oilcloth bundle is everything." She shifted in her saddle. "Which means the letter in your coat is not actually the most dangerous thing Strake is afraid of right now. It's the possibility that there are pieces he hasn't found." Vane finally turned to look at her. "Who has the copies?" "That's what I don't completely know." She said it carefully, because it was careful territory. "Caleb told me there were 5 people. He didn't tell me all 5 names because he said the less I knew, the harder it would be for Strake to get it out of me. He told me 2 of them." "Who?" "A rancher named Devlin Pruitt, about 8 miles north of town. And a woman named Ada Carver, who runs a boarding house on the south end of Dry Mercy." She paused. He might have told Silas Quill more. Quill was the one person Caleb trusted completely, with the full scope of what he'd found. Vane looked back at the ridge to the east. Whatever he'd been watching for was apparently gone, or had never been there. "So Quill isn't just a witness," he said. "He's possibly the only person who knows where all the pieces are." "Yes, which makes getting him out of Black Canyon considerably more urgent than a simple prisoner exchange." "Yes." He rode in silence for a few minutes. The terrain was leveling out slightly. They were coming off the worst of the ravine country, the track ahead running more steadily south between 2 long ridges of pale limestone. "Tell me about the canyon," he said. "The stage station." Eliza pulled up the memory. She'd been through Black Canyon twice, both times with Caleb, the second time less than a year before his death. The canyon runs roughly north to south. The walls are steep 30-40 feet in some places, and the mouth is narrow. There's only one main entry from the north. The stage road runs through the center of the canyon floor. And the station? About 2/3 of the way through. It's a long building used to have a corral on the east side and a storage shed on the west. The main structure is stone. It would be defensible. One entry point from the north, Vane said. What about the south end? The canyon narrows at the south end, and the walls close down to maybe 20 feet apart. The stage road doesn't go through. It stops at the station. Beyond the station, there's a drainage channel that runs along the west wall. She frowned, reaching for something at the edge of her recollection. Caleb surveyed this area. I was with him for part of it. There was something about that drainage channel. He made a note about it. What kind of note? I can't remember exactly. Something about the old construction the stage company dug the channel to keep flash floodwater from undermining the station foundation. She shook her head. I'd have to look at the survey maps. Do you have access to them? Caleb kept copies of all his surveys at the office. She thought about the office above the freight company. The stripped shelves. They cleared out most of the papers. But they were looking for the evidence bundle, not survey records. Survey records they wouldn't have seemed valuable. Are they still there? I don't know, possibly. She looked at him. We'd have to go back to town. Vane absorbed this. They were riding south toward Black Canyon, and going back to town meant going back toward Strake, back into the square, where 6 hours ago there had been a rope around her neck. Not yet, he said. Let's see what we're dealing with at the station first. They reached the mouth of Black Canyon in the early afternoon, when the sun was high enough that the shadows inside the canyon walls were short and unhelpful. Vane stopped them well short of the entry point, far enough back that the limestone walls blocked any view from inside. How many men does Strake keep at his usual operations, he asked. Eliza thought through what she'd observed. He runs maybe 15 to 20 men total. 6 of them are what you'd call permanent fulsar, and 5 others who've been with him for years. The rest are hired on for specific work, she calculated. This morning he had 6 at the square. He'll have sent at least 2 to follow us from town. 2 are behind us right now, Vane said quietly. Have been since about a mile past the ravines. She hadn't heard anything. She believed him anyway. So he might have 4 or 5 at the station, or more, if he moved men from wherever else he was using them. He dismounted. Tied his horse to a juniper branch. I'm going to go up and look. There's a line of rock along the east ridge that should give me a view into the canyon from above. Eliza swung down from her mare. I'll come, he looked at her. The climb he was thinking about was steep. She could see it in the way he'd assessed the rock face when they'd stopped. That ridge I climb when I need to, she said. Her voice was flat in the particular way it got when she was being told what she could and couldn't do. I'm slower than you, probably. But I've been climbing hills since I was 8 years old, and I want to see what we're walking into. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and started for the rock face. The climb was hard. It was also not impossible. The limestone was solid and had enough natural breaks and ledges to give reasonable footing, and Eliza had been right, she was slower, and there were 2 places where she needed a moment to find a line that worked for her weight and reach. But she made it to the ledge line, along the east ridge without assistance and without fanfare, and was only breathing somewhat harder than she'd like when she settled in beside Vane and looked down into the canyon. The stage station was visible from here, a long stone building, faded and weathered, with a collapsed section at the east end, where the original corral wall had given way. 2 horses were tied at the front rail, a thin line of smoke from the chimney. Movement near the front door, a man sitting on the step with what appeared to be a rifle across his knees. 2 horses visible, Vane said very quietly. 1 guard on the door. There'll be at least 1 more inside. Silas Quilson is in there somewhere. Probably the back room, the original sleeping quarters, would be the most contained space. Eliza studied the station layout from above. The storage shed on the west side was still standing, its roof partly collapsed, but the walls intact. And along the west wall of the canyon, just visible between the station's west wall and the canyon itself, the dark line of the drainage channel ran south. The channel, she said. Vane looked where she was indicating. If you enter from the front, every man in that station knows it, she said slowly. But the channel runs behind the station. If there's a rear access as a window, a back door. Someone could come in from behind while the front approach draws attention. Yes. She looked at him. He was already thinking the same thing. She could see it in the set of his jaw, not enthusiasm, more like the focused attention of someone working through geometry. How far do you think the channel runs? From here, it looks like it comes in from the south end of the canyon and runs along the base of the west wall the length of the station. Caleb's survey note, Eliza said. It was coming back now, the memory she'd been reaching for. He noted that the drainage channel had an access point at the south end. The stage company built a maintenance crawl they needed to be able to clear blockages in the channel without getting into the canyon from the main road. She pushed the memory harder. He thought it was significant because it meant there was a secondary way into the station's back area that wasn't visible from the main road. Vane was very still. You remember where the access point is? Not exactly. Somewhere on the south side of the ridge. She paused. I remember him marking it on the survey map with a notation about the construction. If I had the map, could you find it without the map? She looked at the canyon below, the south end of the canyon, where the walls narrowed. The drainage channel running along the west wall. Caleb had made her look at it. She could remember standing on a lower ridge, looking down at the narrow channel, and Caleb points in saying something about the stonework. Maybe, she said, I'd have to walk the south ridge. That means splitting up. Yes. Neither of them said what splitting up meant, given the two men who were currently somewhere behind them on the trail. We need to go back to town first, Vane said. Get those survey maps. Strake's men are watching every entrance to Dry Mercy by now. Probably. He started moving back from the edge. Then we don't use an entrance they're watching. They climbed back down. Eliza moved more carefully going down than going up, feeling the rock with her foot before she committed weight, and she took a longer route than Vane on the last 20 feet, finding a series of ledges that let her descend more or less upright, rather than lowering herself hand over hand. Her arms ached. Her boots were scraped along the left toe where she'd misjudged a step on the way up. She didn't mention either thing. When they reached the horses, Vane was already checking the water in the canteen he carried. He handed it to her without being asked. She drank and handed it back. The two men following us, she said. They're going to report to Strake that we came to Black Canyon. Yes, which means Strake knows we found something at Quill's cabin. Knows we found the note. He'll move Quill, Vane said. Or he'll be waiting for us when we come back. How long do we have before he moves him? Vane mounted his horse and thought about it. If Strake is cautious, he moves Quill tonight. If he's confident, he waits and uses Quill as bait. Strake is always confident, Eliza said. It's his worst quality and his most reliable one. Vane looked at her. You've watched him a long time. 4 years since Caleb started figuring out what he was doing. And the 4 years before that, living in the same town. She mounted her mare, taking a moment to find the stirrup that was always fractionally too short for comfortable mounting, and making the adjustment without thinking about it. You learn how a man operates when you have reason to watch him carefully. What's his pattern when he's threatened? Eliza pulled the mare's head around toward the north. He responds fast and he responds hard. His first instinct is to remove the threat directly. He doesn't prefer negotiation. He prefers elimination. This morning with the hanging was typical. He could have had me arrested and held indefinitely. He chose to hang me. Why the rush? Because he wanted it done before anyone could organize any kind of response. And because she hesitated, working through it, because men like Strake are always, at some level, afraid. They do violent things quickly because if they slow down, they have to think about whether the violent thing is actually necessary. Strake doesn't like thinking about that. So he'll move Quill fast, Vane said. Not because it's the strategically smart choice. Because waiting feels like inaction. Yes, she looked at him. You've known men like him. 1 or 2. They rode north, back toward Dry Mercy, and the afternoon light was moving toward the long amber quality of late afternoon that turned the limestone ridges the color of old honey. Eliza kept her eyes moving. She still couldn't detect the two men behind them, but she believed they were there. And the knowledge of it made her shoulder blades tighten in a way she couldn't completely ignore. What are you thinking? Vane asked. She'd been quiet for a while. I'm thinking about Ada Carver, she said. The woman at the boarding house who has one of Caleb's copies. What about her? She's a practical woman, cautious. Caleb chose her specifically because she wouldn't panic and because she had a reason to keep her mouth shut. She's got a son who was mixed up in something years ago, nothing serious. but Strake knew about it and used it occasionally to remind her that his goodwill was worth having. She paused. Which means Ada has been protected from Strake's worst impulses by a kind of mutual hostility disguised as accommodation. But if Strake decides he needs to search every building in Dry Mercies, she's exposed. Her and everyone else who's been quietly holding a piece of what Caleb found. Eliza looked at the terrain ahead. The freight road was visible about a quarter-mile to the east. They'd angled away from it coming south, and were now on a parallel line that ran through thicker scrub. We need the survey maps. We need Ada. And we need to find Devlin Pruitt. 3 stops in a town where Strake has men watching. Yes. Vane rode without speaking for a moment. Then you know the town better than I do. If we enter from the south, not the freight road, not the main track, is there a way in? Eliza thought about the south end of Dry Mercy. The laundry was there, and behind it the long empty lot that backed up against the wash. In the wet season, the wash ran deep, but this time of year it was barely ankle-high on a horse. The wash, she said. If we come in from the east along the creek bed, we can reach the back of Ada Carver's boarding house without crossing the main street. Any of Strake's regular men stationed south of town? He usually keeps one man near the livery, which is on the south end of the main street. But the main street and the wash are separated by a full block of buildings. She ran the route in her head. We'd have to cross one open lot, about 40 feet. At night, she looked at the sky. They had 3 hours of light left, maybe a little more. If we circle wide to the east and come back in after dark, yes. Then that's what we do. He glanced back, very casually, in a way that would look like a man checking the terrain rather than looking for followers. We need somewhere to wait out the light. There's an old homestead about 2 miles east of here. Abandoned, the family left 3 years ago when Strake foreclosed on their mortgage. She said it without inflection, but the meaning of it sat in the air between them. The foreclosure was part of the pattern, part of what Caleb had documented, part of what had gotten Caleb killed. The structure is still standing. We can rest the horses there. They found the homestead as the sun was getting serious about its descent, a small frame house with a sagging porch and windows, long since stripped of glass, the interior smelling of dust and old wood and mouse habitation. The barn behind it was in better shape, the roof still mostly solid, and they put the horses there, with water from a trough, Vane pumped by hand from the well, which was dry at the surface and required significant persuasion before it yielded anything useful. It yielded something eventually. It always did, with enough persistence. Eliza sat on an overturned crate in the barn's main aisle and ate the dried meat and hardtack she'd had in her coat pocket since. Strake's men had dragged her out of her house before dawn. She'd grabbed her coat off the hook by instinct, and the food had been in the right-hand pocket from a ride she'd taken 3 days ago. The fact that it was still there felt like a small, unreasonable mercy. Vane settled on the floor nearby, with his back against the barn wall and his revolver on his knee, and ate his own provisions, which were minimal in the way of a man who'd been riding hard and rationing for 2 days. "Tell me about Quill," Vane said. "What kind of man is he?" Eliza chewed and thought. Old, 65, maybe older. "He lost 2 fingers on his right hand years ago, a surveying accident," Caleb said. "He's careful with his work, very precise. He came out west when he was young and spent 40 years documenting land nobody else wanted to bother with." She paused. "He's not a brave man, particularly. I don't mean that unkindly. He helped Caleb, because what Strake was doing offended his professional integrity. The fraud involved falsified survey records, and that was something Quill took personally. It wasn't moral courage, exactly. It was the anger of a craftsman watching his craft being perverted. Will he hold up under pressure? I don't know, she said honestly. He left that note at the cabin, which means he had his wits about him when they took him, and he managed to get enough time alone to hide a message. That's something. She looked at her hands. He's an old man held by dangerous people in an abandoned building. I don't know what 4 or 5 days of that does to a person. Vane was quiet. You're wondering if he's already told them what he knows, Eliza said. It occurred to me. It occurred to me, too. She folded the paper from the dried meat carefully, because it was the kind of thing her hands did when her mind was working hard. Even if he has, it doesn't change our situation much. They need Quill alive as long as they think they can use him to get Caleb's letter. And Caleb's letter isn't the most dangerous thing we have. The copies. Yes, which Strake can't access unless he knows who has them and in what form. She looked at Vane. Quill might know all 5 names. I only know 2. If Strake has gotten to Quill, and Quill has talked then, Devlin Pruett and Ada Carver are in danger right now. Vane stood. The light through the barn's high-gap windows was going orange and thin. We go as soon as it's dark, he said. Yes. If Strake's moved against Carver already. Then we deal with that when we find it. She stood too, brushing dust from her skirt in a gesture that was more habit than utility. Mr. Vane. Brenner. She corrected herself. I need to ask you something. He looked at her. What exactly are you planning? When this is over, what does the end of it look like to you? He thought about it. Not quickly, not with the performance of careful consideration, but actually thought about it. Quill testifies. The copies get consolidated with the main bundle. Federal authorities territorial level, above whoever Strake's bought locally, get a case they can prosecute. He met her eyes. Strake in prison. The families who lost land get a legal path to reclaim it. The sheriff and whoever else is on Strake's payroll gets exposed. That's not quick. No, it's months, possibly a year. Yes, she looked at him steadily. And you'll stay for that. Something shifted in his expression. Not discomfort, more like the kind of recalibration that happens when a person realizes the question is more serious than they initially took it for. I said the debt doesn't expire. The debt is to Caleb. Caleb is dead. She wasn't being cruel. She was being precise, which was different. I'm asking if you'll stay for the work. Vane held her gaze. Yes, he said. I'll stay for the work. She nodded once. That was enough. She didn't need more than that. They waited out the last of the light in the barn, and when full dark came they rode east along the wash and then south, circling wide, the horses moving quietly on the soft creekbed ground. The stars were out in the desert-clear way that made the sky look like something personal. Dry mercy came up on them from the south, the lights of the main street visible as a distant warm line between dark buildings. They left the horses in a shallow draw a quarter-mile out and went the rest of the way on foot, and Eliza led because she knew the ground, and Vane accepted this without comment. The 40 feet of open lot between the wash and Ada Carver's back fence took 30 seconds to cross at a low, careful walk. No sound from the main street. A dog barked somewhere 3 blocks north and then stopped. They reached the back door of the boarding house. Eliza knocked. 3 quick, 2 slow. Caleb's pattern, from years ago, from a time when they'd all been younger and less frightened, and the danger had still felt theoretical. Silence. Then a lamp moved behind the curtain. The door opened 2 inches, chain still on, and a woman's eye appeared in the gap, sharp and dark and very awake in the way of someone who hadn't been sleeping. Eliza Harland, the woman said. Her voice was flat with the kind of controlled shock of someone who's trained themselves not to show strong reactions. I heard they hanged you this morning. They tried, Eliza said. Ada, we need to come in. The chain came off. Ada Carver was a small woman, somewhere in her mid-50s, with iron gray hair pinned back in a way that had once been neat and was now listing from a long day. She had a lamp in one hand and a short-barreled shotgun leaning against the wall inside the door that she didn't acknowledge and didn't put away. She looked at Vane. Who's this? Brenner Vane. He was Caleb's friend. Ada looked at him the way she looked at everything quickly and thoroughly, and with very little sentiment involved. I've had 2 of Strake's men through here today, she said. Asking questions. Said they were looking for anyone who might be hiding a woman. She glanced at Eliza. Meaning you. Did they search the building? They wanted to. I told them they were welcome to do so as soon as they came back with a paper from the territorial court. She said it with the flat satisfaction of someone who'd read enough legal paperwork in her life to know what questions to ask. They didn't come back. They'll come back with a paper, Vane said. I know that. She moved back from the door. Come in then. Keep the lamp away from the windows. The kitchen smelled like flour and old coffee, and the particular density of a room that had been lived in by many different people over many years. Ada set the lamp on the floor and motioned them to sit, and they sat. And she remained standing because she was that kind of woman, the kind who makes decisions from a standing position. What do you need, she said. The papers Caleb gave you, Eliza said. And whatever you know about who else he gave copies to. Ada was quiet for a moment. not hesitating, processing. I've had those papers in my flour bin for 8 months, she said. Every day I think about burning them, and every day I don't. She looked at Eliza steadily. Because Caleb asked me to keep them, and he told me why, and he was right. He was right about all of it, wasn't he? Yes, Eliza said quietly. Ada went to the pantry. The sound of ceramic moving, the soft impact of a bin being set on a counter. She came back with a flour-dusted oilskin envelope and held it out. Eliza took it. There were 3 others, Ada said, sitting down now that the decision was made. Caleb told me in case something happened to him and you needed to collect them yourself. Devlin Pruitt has a set. A man named Josiah Reed, who works the mine office. Caleb said he'd been keeping track of the shipping records and knew where the numbers didn't match. And a woman named Clara Holt who used to work Strake's kitchen. She paused. Clara left town 4 months ago, right after Caleb died. I don't know where she went. Did she take the papers with her? I don't know that either. Ada's jaw was tight. 4 months ago, I wasn't sure I was going to be alive long enough to worry about it. Vane leaned forward slightly. Pruitt and Reed. Are they reachable? Pruitt is at his ranch. Reed, I heard he's been keeping his head down since last month. He had some trouble with the mine foreman. What kind of trouble? Eliza asked. The kind where a man who's been asking too many questions about shipping records suddenly gets told his job is being given to someone else. Ada looked at her hands. He's staying at the Miller place, north end of town. His wife's sister is there. Eliza looked at Vane. He was already doing the same arithmetic she was. How many stops? How much time? How much of the night they had left before Strake's men were moving again? Ada, Eliza said. If we move tonight, if we get Pruitt and Reed to bring their copies, and we can get Silas Quill out of Black Canyon, we have enough to go to the territorial authorities and make a case that can't be suppressed. Ada looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't a sentimental woman. She wasn't frightened in any obvious way. She was a woman who'd been managing a difficult situation for 8 months with careful patience and no assurance that it would ever amount to anything. Then go get him out of that canyon, she said. We'll need the survey maps from Caleb's office first, Eliza said. To find the rear access to the station, Caleb's office, Ada thought. The freight office. Strake's men cleared it. They took the evidence. They might have left the survey records. Olin Pitts manages the freight office, Ada said. He's got a key to everything in that building. She paused. He's a cautious man. He stood in that square this morning and didn't say a word. She said it not quite with contempt, more with the exhausted accuracy of someone taking inventory. But he's not Strake's man. He's just afraid. Will he help? Ada stood. That depends on whether he thinks you're going to win. She looked at Eliza with something that was close to blunt respect. Are you? Eliza thought about the oilskin bundle in her hands, about Ada's papers, about Pruitt and Reed and the missing Clara Holt, about Silas Quill in an abandoned stone building with men paid to keep him there, about the note hidden under a floor mat, about the survey maps and the drainage channel and the thing Caleb had told her once about preparation, that it was just future bravery stored up in advance. Yes, she said. Ada Carver looked at her for another second. Then she picked up the shotgun from beside the door and held it out to Vane. Extra shells are in the kitchen drawer, she said. You look like you could use a better weapon than whatever you're carrying. Vane took it. He checked it without comment, found it loaded and in order. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, Ada said. Come back with that old surveyor and make sure every one of those papers ends up in front of someone with the authority to do something about it. She opened the back door. The night outside was dark and quiet and smelled like dust and the faint iron tang of the wash. And Eliza. Eliza stopped. Caleb knew what he was doing when he wrote your name in that letter, Ada said. He told me once. About 2 years ago, he said the smartest thing he'd ever done was marry a woman the whole town was busy underestimating. Her voice was dry. Turns out he was right about that, too. Eliza said nothing. She stepped out into the dark. Vane followed, and the door closed behind them, and they moved through the night toward Olin Pitts and the freight office and whatever remained of Caleb Harlan's careful work. Behind them, Ada Carver turned up the lamp to a more useful height and began, quietly and methodically, to pack a bag. Olin Pitts answered his door in a nightshirt, and the expression of a man who'd been lying awake, expecting exactly this kind of knock and dreading it anyway. He was a heavy-set man in his early 50s, with thinning hair and the permanently worried look of someone who'd spent decades trying to keep a small business alive in a town controlled by someone who considered small businesses useful only when they were compliant. He held a lamp at chest height and looked at Eliza Harland on his doorstep and said nothing for a full 3 seconds. "You're alive," he said finally. "Disappointed?" Eliza said. It was a hard thing to say, and she said it evenly, without heat, which made it harder. Pitts flinched. He'd stood in that square this morning. He knew what he'd done and hadn't done, and the knowledge of it was clearly sitting on him like a stone. "No," he said. "No, I'm Eliza. I'm sorry, I didn't. There were men with guns, and I have a wife, and—" "Olin," she stopped him, not unkindly. "I'm not here about this morning. I need the freight office key. Caleb's survey records the ones from the past 3 years. If they're still there." Pitts looked past her at Vane, who was standing far enough back to be mostly shadow. "Who is that?" "Someone who helped me this morning," she said. "The key, Olin." He looked at her for another moment. He was calculating, she could see it. The same calculation the whole town was running. Which side of this is safer? Which way does this go? What does it cost me to help? And what does it cost me not to? She let him calculate. She didn't have time to persuade him, but she also understood that pushing too hard would produce refusal out of sheer overwhelm. "Strake's going to know," Pitt said. "Strake already knows as I'm alive and making trouble. Your involvement in this is exactly as dangerous as it was when Caleb was doing the same work and you were looking the other way." She met his eyes. "The difference is, this time you have a choice to make that might actually matter." His jaw worked. He turned back inside. The lamp disappeared for a minute, and there was the sound of a drawer, the soft clatter of keys on a ring, and then he came back and held them out. "Third key," he said. "The brass one, second-floor door." He paused. "The survey ledgers are in the cabinet on the left wall." Strake's men took everything off the shelves, but they didn't open the cabinet. "I don't know why. Maybe they didn't see it." Eliza took the keys. "Thank you, Eliza." His voice dropped. "If this works, if you actually manage to..." He stopped. "Started again, my brother-in-law. Strake took his grazing land 2 years ago on a fraudulent water rights claim. If there's any chance of getting it back, if we get the evidence to the right people, everyone Strake cheated has a legal path." She looked at him steadily. "But that only happens if the evidence survives tonight." Pitts nodded. He didn't say anything else. He closed the door and the lamp retreated behind the curtain, and Eliza and Vane moved through the dark street toward the freight office. The building was 2 blocks from Ada's boarding house, on the same side of town, and the back approach along the alley kept them out of sight of the main street. Vane went first at the alley entrance, spent 30 seconds reading the dark, then waved her forward. The freight office's back door was solid and the lock was stiff, but the brass key worked after a second forceful try. They went up the stairs without a light. Eliza had been in the office enough times to navigate it in the dark, and she moved directly to the left wall cabinet, felt for the handle, and pulled it open. The survey ledgers were there. 8 of them, fat leather-bound volumes with years marked on the spines in Caleb's careful hand. She ran her fingers across the spines until she found the one she needed, the territorial survey volume covering the Black Canyon area, completed 18 months ago. She pulled it out. Vane struck a match, shielding the flame with his body so it wouldn't show through the window. The light lasted long enough for her to find the right page's Caleb's survey of Black Canyon and the stage station, detailed and precise, with notations in his small, neat handwriting along the margins. There, on the west wall entry, drainage channel access maintenance crawl, original stage co. Construction approx. 3 feet clearance opens south of station rear wall. Stone cap removable, and a small sketch. The crawl entrance was on the south side of the canyon's west ridge, about 60 feet beyond where the canyon walls narrowed. From the sketch, it was a horizontal opening, low to the ground, large enough for a person to move through on hands and knees. "Can you read it?" Vane asked. The match was going. "I have it," Eliza said. She closed her eyes and held the image of the page in her mind, the way she'd trained herself to hold things, numbers, names, maps, conversations over 4 months of silent investigation. The crawl entrance, the sketch, the notation about the stone cap. She had it. The match went out. They stood in the dark for a moment. That crawl, Vane said quietly. You think a person can move through it? The notation says 3 feet of clearance. She paused. I'm not a small woman, Brenner. He didn't respond to that the way most men would have. He didn't reassure her, and he didn't pretend the concern wasn't real. He just said, how confident are you that the sketch dimensions are accurate? Caleb measured everything twice. She replaced the ledger in the cabinet. He didn't round. Then we find out when we get there. He moved toward the stairs. We need Pruett's copy of the documents, and this read the man from the mine office. Pruett is 8 miles north. Too far tonight. She followed him down the stairs. Reed is closer. Ada said the Miller place, north end of town. Can we reach it without crossing the main street? Yes. It'll take longer. Then we go. Josiah Reed was a thin man in his 40s with the careful eyes of someone who'd spent years reading numbers, and the particular tension of a man who understood that those numbers had become dangerous to him. He came to the door of the Miller place's back entrance. His sister-in-law had apparently prepared him for the possibility of night visitors, because he had his boots on and a coat over his arm when he opened the door. He looked at Eliza with the expression of someone encountering a piece of news they'd given up expecting. I thought you were dead, he said. People keep saying that, she said. Do you have the papers Caleb gave you? Reed glanced behind him. A woman's voice from inside his sister-in-law, asking who was there. He called back that it was nothing, a neighbor, everything was fine, and then turned back to Eliza, with the expression of a man maintaining several fictions simultaneously. I have them, he said. They're yes. I kept them the way Caleb said. Separate, in a different location from my house. He hesitated. They're at the mine office. I hid them in the assay records room. Strake's men have been through my house twice, but they never thought to look there. Can you get to them tonight? The mine office is locked at night. But I have a key. He looked between her and Vane. What's happening? What are you doing with all of this? Collecting everything Caleb distributed, Eliza said. All of it together, consolidated, goes to the territorial authorities. Not the county office federal level. Strake can't reach that far. Reed absorbed this. He was the kind of man who processed information carefully, who turned things over before committing, and under other circumstances, Eliza suspected he'd have wanted to take more time. But something in his face said he'd been sitting in his sister-in-law's house for 4 days with his boots on at all times, and he was past the point of wanting to think carefully. Silas Quill, he said. Caleb told me Silas knew the full picture. Where is he? Black Canyon, Vane said. Strake has him. Reed's face went flat. Then you need to get him out before any of the rest of this matters. Because Silas is the one who can explain what the documents mean. The rest of us can hand over papers, but Silas can stand in front of a judge and explain the entire fraud from the ground up. He looked at Eliza directly. You know that. I know that, she said. We're going tonight. They went to the mine office, a squat building on the edge of town, where the land started rising toward the ore-bearing hills to the northeast. Reed moved through it with the confidence of a man who'd worked there for 11 years and knew every shadow and creek, and he retrieved a flat envelope from behind a loose panel in the assay records room, with the practiced ease of someone who'd checked on it every few days for months. He handed it to Eliza. She added it to the oilskin envelope from Ada. The consolidated bundle was growing. Come with us, Vane said to Reed unexpectedly. Reed blinked. To Black Canyon? We may need someone who can explain what the numbers mean if Quill is in worse condition than we're hoping. Vane's voice was matter of fact. I'm not asking you to fight anyone. I'm asking you to be there when we bring him out. Reed looked at the envelope in Eliza's hands, at the mine office around him, at his coat, which he was still carrying folded over his arm. My wife and children are at her mother's place in Tucson, he said slowly. I sent them 2 weeks ago when it started feeling like things were moving. He put the coat on. Give me 10 minutes to leave a note for my sister-in-law. He wrote the note. They left. They collected their horses from the draw south of town, and they rode north to collect Devlin Pruett because 8 miles was too far to skip, and his copy of Caleb's documents was the one Eliza knew contained the clearest record of the fraudulent land transfers, the specific legal language Strake had manipulated to make the claims look legitimate. Pruett was awake when they arrived. which was either good instincts or the inability to sleep that affected anyone who'd been sitting on explosive information for most of a year. He was a rangy man in his 60s, with a gray beard and the kind of handshake that communicated decades of physical work. He listened to Eliza's explanation without interrupting, and then went to his barn and came back with a tin box and handed her the documents without asking for guarantees. "Caleb told me you'd come eventually," Pruitt said. He looked at her in the darkness with a kind of directness that wasn't unkind. He said, "If it ever comes to it and Eliza shows up at your door, give her the box. Don't ask too many questions." Eliza took the box. Her throat tightened, and she let it tighten and then let it pass. "Did he say anything else?" she asked. Pruitt thought about it. "He said you'd know what to do with it." A pause. He seemed pretty sure about that. She put the documents with the others. There were 4 riders leaving Pruitt's ranch in the dark before 3 in the morning: Eliza, Vane, Reed, and Pruitt, who'd decided without being invited that he was coming along because it was his land and his neighbor's land, and he'd been patient long enough. Vane hadn't argued. There were times when extra bodies mattered more than convenience, and this appeared to be one of them. They rode south under the hard, clear stars, and Eliza went over the plan in her head, testing it the way she tested numbers, looking for the place where it didn't hold. The plan was simple in the way of plans that have to work in the dark with incomplete information. Vane would enter through the front of the station, openly, with Caleb's letter visible, presenting himself as a man coming to negotiate. He would be the thing that every armed man in that building was looking at. While he was the thing they were looking at, Eliza would enter through the drainage crawl at the south end of the canyon, reach the rear of the station, and locate Quill. The problems with the plan were numerous. She might not fit through the crawl. The stone cap might not be removable after years of disuse. There might be a guard at the rear of the station she couldn't see from the ridge. Quill might be in a condition that made moving him quickly impossible. Strake's messenger, who had apparently arrived at their camp outside town, while Eliza and Vane were at Adia's, because Vane had found sign of it when he checked on the horses, might have changed the situation inside the station entirely. The messenger. Eliza had been thinking about that since Vane mentioned it. Strake sending a messenger to his men at the station meant one of 2 things. Either he was warning them that Vane and Eliza had been to Black Canyon and were likely coming back, or he was issuing new instructions about Quill. Neither possibility was comforting. They stopped a mile from the canyon mouth and tied the horses. Pruitt and Reed stayed with the horses. Their job, if something went wrong inside, was to ride hard for the territorial office in Yuma with the consolidated documents and Eliza's written account of what Caleb had found. Vane had insisted on the written account, and Eliza had produced it in 15 minutes by lamplight at Pruitt's ranch, compressed, factual, the kind of document a woman who'd spent 4 months tracking numbers could produce without wasted words. "You don't have to go through that crawl," Vane said. They were on foot now, moving toward the canyon mouth in the dark. He said it without looking at her, which was the right way to say it, not a challenge, not persuasion, just a fact being placed in front of her. "I know," she said. "It might not," she said again. "I've been thinking about it for 6 hours. If there's another way to get Quill out without you walking directly into 5 armed men with nothing but a letter as cover, tell me what it is." He was quiet. "There isn't one," she said. "So we do this." The mouth of Black Canyon was a narrow notch in the limestone that the darkness made narrower. They separated at the entry vein, going straight in along the canyon floor, Eliza angling up the west ridge to circle south of the station's position. The climb in the dark was harder than it had been in daylight. She moved carefully, testing each foothold, using the rock face rather than fighting it, and she didn't rush because rushing in the dark over unfamiliar terrain was how a person got hurt in a way that ended the whole enterprise. She could hear her own breathing. She could not hear Vane below in the canyon, which meant he was moving quietly, which was either good or meant he'd already encountered someone. She kept moving. The south end of the canyon was narrower than she'd expected from above, the walls rising close on both sides, and the floor of the canyon 20 feet below. She was on the west ridge now, working along its top, and she looked for the place where the ridge dropped toward the drainage channel. She found it by feel more than sight, a section of the ridge, where the rock stepped down in stages toward the canyon wall. and along the base of the wall, barely visible in the starlight, the dark line of the channel. She got down from the ridge to the channel mouth in 3 awkward stages that were nothing like elegant and involved one moment of genuine uncertainty when her left foot found nothing where she expected rock to be. She caught herself with both hands and pressed flat against the limestone and breathed until her heart stopped its objection. Then she moved on. The channel ran along the base of the canyon's west wall, a stone-lined cut about 2 feet wide, running with the thin trickle of an underground spring. The maintenance crawl access was supposed to be somewhere in this section, on the south side, before the channel curved under the station's foundation. She felt along the wall, stone rough and cold, then a different texture smoother, more regular. Fitted stone rather than natural limestone. She worked along it with both hands and found the edge a rectangular section, approximately 3 feet wide and perhaps 2.5 feet high, set into the wall with a stone cap wedged in from the outside. 3 feet wide. She put her hands flat on the cap and pushed. Nothing. Pushed again, harder. A grinding sound that she immediately stopped, because a grinding sound in a silent canyon at 3 in the morning was the kind of thing that carried. She breathed. She pushed steadily with her shoulder, using her weight instead of her arms. The cap shifted an inch, then 2. Then it moved with a low scraping sound that seemed enormous in the quiet and probably wasn't as loud as it felt, and she pulled it out and set it against the wall and looked at the opening. Caleb had measured everything twice and he didn't round, and the crawl was exactly what his notation had said. 3 feet clearance, roughly. She looked at it for a moment. The darkness inside was complete. She could smell cold stone and stale air and the faint mineral trace of water. She thought about the rope this morning, the wagon, the noose, the fact that she was still alive and Silas Quill was somewhere in a stone building 60 feet north of where she was crouching. She went in head first. It was the worst 60 feet she'd ever covered. The crawl was not designed for comfort. It was a drainage maintenance passage, built to be functional rather than navigable, and the stone floor was uneven and cold, and her elbows found every rough edge, and her knees found the rest. She was breathing in shallow pulls because the space was too low to fill her lungs completely, and the air was bad, not dangerously bad, but stale in the way of confined spaces that hadn't moved air in years. Twice she had to stop and manage the simple fact of her own size in a space that had not been built for a woman of her dimensions. The second time, somewhere in the middle of the crawl, there was a low section where the ceiling dropped and she had to turn sideways, and she wasn't certain, for about 15 seconds, that she was going to get through it. She got through it. The far end of the crawl opened into a stone-lined alcove at the base of the station's rear wall, a storage space of some kind, accessed by a wooden door that had swollen its frame over years of disuse. She pushed it. The door resisted. She pushed harder, with her shoulder and all the weight she had available, and the door gave with a groan that she could not have muffled if she'd tried. She stopped, listened. From the far end of the building, the front, she could hear voices. Not Vane's voice yet. She hadn't heard the sounds of his entry, which meant either he hadn't entered yet or he'd entered more quietly than she expected. She moved through the storage alcove to the interior door, which was slightly ajar, and looked through the gap into the rear room of the stage station. Silas Quill was there. He was seated on the floor against the far wall, with his wrists tied to a heavy iron ring that had been bolted to the stone, probably an original stable tie from when the station housed horses in transit. He was an old man, and he looked older than she remembered. His face was gray with fatigue, and something had happened to his left eye. It was swollen, nearly shut. Not recent, but not old either. Maybe 2 days ago. He was awake. Barely. He was watching the door to the front room with the fixed attention of a man who'd been listening to events he couldn't see for several days and had learned to read a great deal into sound alone. When the storage door opened, he turned toward it. His good eye landed on Eliza. He stared. She put her finger to her lips. He stared for another second, and then something in his face did a complicated thing, a collapse and a reconstruction happening almost simultaneously. The way a man's face moves when he's been holding himself together through sheer effort and suddenly has a reason to let some of the effort go. He nodded. She came across the room to him. His wrists were tied with good rope, the kind of knot that had been pulled tight over days of wear, and was now almost structural. She didn't have a knife, She'd left it the folding knife from Vane's pocket, which he'd given her at Pruitt's ranch. She'd left it in her coat pocket, and her coat was. She had the coat. She'd had it on. She found the knife. Went to work on the rope. The knot was bad. Her fingers weren't as dexterous as they might have been after the crawl. Her hands were cold and scraped, and one of her nails had torn back to the quick on the stone floor. She worked at the rope anyway, feeling for the structure of the knot in the dark with her fingers, finding the crossing points, working the slack in the right direction. Eliza Harland, Quill breathed. His voice was barely sound. He told me someone would come. I didn't. I wasn't sure. Hold still, she said softly. I need to get this knot. There are 3 men, he breathed. 2 in the front room. 1 out back. He was walking the perimeter last I heard. He comes around every 20 minutes or so. Every 20 minutes. She had no idea how long she'd been in the crawl. Long enough that her knees were going to complain about it for a week. She worked faster. The eye, she said quietly. That was the first day. He said it without self-pity, the flat report of a man providing information. When I wouldn't tell them where the other copies were. After that, they seemed to decide I was more useful intact. Did you tell them anything? A pause. I told them the copies existed. I told them there were multiple people holding them. Another pause, and this one carried weight. I didn't tell them who. That's enough, she said. The rope gave a fraction. Quill, do you know a 5th person? Caleb distributed copies to 5 people. I have 4 accounted for. Clara Holt was the 5th she left town. Clara Holt. His voice was a little stronger. She went to Tucson. Her sister is there. He stopped. She is the most dangerous piece. The signed correspondence letters from Strake to the county recorder, discussing the fraudulent claims in terms that are essentially a confession if you know what you're reading. The rope came free. Quill pulled his wrists apart and then held them against his chest. For a moment, eyes closed, doing the thing you do when sensation starts returning to places that have been compressed and still too long. From the front room sound. A door. And then a voice Eliza recognized from the square, a long day ago that already felt like a week. Brenner Vane's voice, steady and carrying. I'm looking for Harlan Strake's man. I've got an offer worth hearing. He was in. The front door was open, and he was standing in the light of whatever lamp was burning in the front room, and every armed man in the building was looking at him. Eliza got Quill to his feet. He was stiff, seriously stiff. The stiffness of a man who'd been mostly sedentary in a cold room for 4 or 5 days, and his legs took his weight reluctantly. She got his arm over her shoulders and took as much of his weight as she could, and she moved them both toward the storage alcove. She could hear the conversation from the front room clearly now. You Fulser's man? Vane was saying. Who's asking? A voice she didn't know. My name's Vane. Strake knows who I am. I want to make a trade. Strake doesn't trade. Strake will want to hear this offer. The sound of something being set on a table, deliberate, heavy enough to make a sound. I've got Caleb Harlan's letter. I've got the evidence bundle. I'm willing to surrender both in exchange for the surveyor. Silence from the front room. Why would you do that? The unknown voice said. Because the woman isn't worth dying over, Vane said. She's already gone. She left town this morning with whatever Caleb had. She's not my problem anymore. But Strake is going to keep coming after me, as long as he thinks I have something he wants. So I'm here to finish the exchange and walk away. It was a plausible lie. It was exactly plausible enough to require consideration. Consideration took time, and time was what Eliza needed. She got Quill into the storage alcove. The drop to the crawl entrance was 2 feet. She helped him down, felt him wince at the impact on his knees, steadied him before he could make a sound. Crawl, she breathed directly into his ear, straight through. Don't stop, don't make noise. There's a man outside on a perimeter walk. Quill looked at the crawl opening, then at her. I'm 67 years old, he breathed. I know, she said. I just came through it from the other side. Go. He went. She waited until she heard him moving slow, effortful, but moving, and then she looked back at the interior door. She could still hear Vane talking. The man he was talking to had not called him on the lie yet. And then a third voice, from closer than the front room. From somewhere in the middle of the building. Reardon. Go check on the old man. Eliza moved. She dropped into the crawl and pulled the entrance cover behind her as far as she could reach, not all the way closed, but pulled in, enough to look like undisturbed stone from a quick glance in dim light. She could hear Quill ahead of her, moving with a determined slowness that was still movement, and she followed, pulling herself through the low section faster than she had the first time, because fear is a remarkable motivator. She could hear footsteps in the rear room above and behind her. A pause, the sound of the interior door opening wider. A voice, confused. What in the... She kept moving. The crawl exit was ahead. She could see the pale rectangle of open air where the stone cap had been removed. Quill reached it, and she heard him drop out, and then she came through after him, and they were in the open channel, in the thin trickle of water, in the cold, dark air of the canyon's south end. Move, she breathed, against the wall, away from the canyon floor. They pressed against the west wall and moved south away from the station, away from the channel entrance, into the narrowing section, where the canyon walls closed to 20 feet, and the darkness was nearly absolute. From behind them, from the direction of the station, a shout. Then another. Then the sound of the front door being thrown open. And then, cutting across all of it, a single sharp report from inside the building. Not a shot fired in anger, the sound was wrong for that, less explosive. More like a piece of furniture being overturned onto stone flooring. And then Brenner Vane's voice again, through the front wall of the station, raised for the first time all night. I said, "Sit down." Eliza stopped moving. Quill stopped beside her. From the south end of the canyon, working along the base of the east wall, she could see the open land beyond the canyon, mouth gray dark, open, the beginning of the approach to where Pruitt and Reed were waiting with the horses. But Vane was still inside. Quill was leaning heavily against her shoulder. He was moving under his own power, but it was costing him, and his breathing was labored in a way that came from days of confined stress and cold and poor food rather than the exertion of the last 10 minutes. "Can you walk to the canyon mouth?" she said quietly. "I can walk," he said. "Don't worry about me. I need you to go straight south when you clear the canyon. There are 2 men with horses, Pruitt and Reed. Stay with them." He looked at her. In the dark, she could only see the outline of his face, the glint of his one open eye. "What are you doing? I'm going back," she said. "Eliza." Silas. She looked at him the way she'd looked at Brenner Vane in the empty homestead, with the particular clarity of someone who's moved past the point where other people's assessments of her capabilities are interesting. Vane came through the front door of that building with 5 armed men and a lie. He's kept them occupied long enough for us to get out. I'm not leaving him in there. Quill stared at her for a moment. "There's a messenger from Strake," he said suddenly. "He arrived this afternoon. He told the men that Strake is coming himself. Tonight." He looked at the canyon. Strake was already on his way when the messenger left. He might be at the canyon mouth right now. The cold that moved through her was not the temperature. "How many men with him?" The messenger said 4. Plus his Quill stopped. "Eliza, you and Vane came here with 2 people and horses. Strake is bringing 4 armed men." "I know the math," she said. "You can't."
Silas.
Her voice was quiet and absolutely firm. "You have everything Caleb collected. Everything. Reed has the consolidated documents. You are the only person alive who can explain the full scope of what Strake did to a judge." She met his eye. "You need to get to those horses. Right now. That is the most important thing that happens tonight. Do you understand me?" He understood. She could see that he understood. He also didn't like it, and she respected that, and she didn't have time to discuss it. "Go," she said. He went. She watched him move south along the canyon wall until his shape was absorbed by the dark. Then she turned north, back toward the station, and a sound reached her from the direction of the canyon mouth that stopped her cold. Hooves, multiple horses, moving at a walk, which was worse than a run because it meant they weren't in a hurry. Harlan Strake had arrived. She pressed herself flat against the west wall and looked north toward the station. The front door was still open. She could see lamplight spilling out across the canyon floor. From inside, she could hear the controlled low sound of Vane's voice, still talking, still holding the men's attention. He didn't know Strake was here. She looked south. Quill was gone far enough that she couldn't see him. Gone to the horses, gone with Pruitt and Reed and the consolidated evidence, and everything Caleb had spent his life building. She looked at the station. Harlan Strake rode into the light from the station door and dismounted, And even from 60 feet away, even in the dim yellow spill of lamplight on stone, Eliza could read the way his body moved, controlled and purposeful, in the way of a man who's angry and is not going to show it until he has complete dominion of the situation. He walked to the front door of the station. He stopped in the doorway. And Eliza Harland, pressed against the cold stone of the canyon wall, with the sounds of moving water and moving horses, and her own careful breathing the only sounds in her immediate world, made a decision that had nothing to do with calculation, and everything to do with the kind of clarity that comes when you've already been prepared to die once in a single day, and found that what comes after it is a strange, hard, absolutely specific kind of courage. She moved toward the station, not running, not rushing. Moving the way she'd moved through every difficult thing in the past year deliberately, with her weight forward and her eyes open, and her hands at her sides, completely visible, walking toward the lit doorway and the man standing in it and whatever came next. Harlan Strake heard her footsteps on the canyon stone and turned. He looked at her. She looked back. "Mr. Strake," she said. Her voice carried in the canyon without effort. Calm in the way stone is calm, not because it doesn't feel the pressure, but because it was built for it. "I think it's time we talked about what Caleb found." Strake stared at her. Inside the station, she heard Brenner Vane's voice go quiet. And then, from the direction of the southern canyon mouth, far away and getting farther, the sound of horses beginning to run. The sound of those horses running south was the best thing Eliza had heard all night. And she held on to it for exactly the 2 seconds she could afford, before Harlan Strake's face reorganized itself from shock into something considerably more dangerous. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her all her life, the quick, dismissive assessment of a man who'd spent decades deciding what people were worth at a glance. But something was different in it now. She could see him recalculating. She could see him doing the arithmetic she'd already done, the horses running south, the old surveyor who was supposed to be tied to a wall, the fact that Eliza Harland was standing in a canyon at 3 in the morning when she was supposed to be dead. "Where is he?" Strake said. "Not a question. Gone," she said. "An hour ahead of you, or close enough." His jaw tightened. One of his 4 men had come up behind him on horseback and stopped at the station door, reading the scene without understanding it. Inside, she could hear the particular quality of a room holding its breath, Vane and the station guards, a standoff that had been in progress when Strake arrived and hadn't resolved itself. "You came back," Strake said. "Quill is out and you came back." He looked at her as if she were a problem in arithmetic that wasn't behaving correctly. "Why?" "Because you were going to walk in there and shoot Brenner Vane," she said. "And I wasn't going to let that happen." Strake made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You weren't going to let it happen." He turned to the man behind him. "Go find Quill. Take the other 2 and ride south." "He's got a head start," Eliza said, "and he's with people who know where they're going." Strake turned back to her. "You're not in a position to give me information strategically, Mrs. Harland. You're in a position where I have 4 armed men, and you have nothing." "I have the letter," she said. He went still. She reached into her coat slowly, so nobody made a bad decision, and pulled out the folded paper. Caleb's letter to Vane. She held it up in the lamplight that spilled from the station door. "This is what you wanted this morning," she said. "Enough to hang me over it." Strake's eyes went to the letter. She could see the want in him, not the desperate want of a man in trouble, but the cold, acquisitive want of a man who'd built his entire life on making sure he held everything, and everyone else held nothing. "Hand it over, no." Inside the station, she heard movement, a scuffle, brief, the sound of something hitting a wall. Then Vane's voice, low and controlled, then silence again. "My husband found something you couldn't buy and couldn't scare away," she said. "That bothered you." "It bothered you because men like Caleb, methodical, patient, willing to spend years building a record before they did anything with it, are the one kind of threat that money and muscle can't address cleanly." She looked at Strake steadily. "You had him killed. I know it, and you know it, and eventually a judge is going to know it too. That's not a question anymore." Strake took a step toward her. "The only judge who matters in this county is bought," she said. "I know. So are the sheriff and 2 of the 3 men in the territorial land office." She kept her voice even. "That's in the documents too." Caleb was very thorough. Strake stopped. She watched him process that. The particular stillness of a man who's discovering that the ground he's been standing on is less solid than it appeared. You don't have those documents, he said. You took one set, there were 5, she held his gaze. Silas Quill is riding south right now with 4 of them consolidated. The 5th is in Tucson with a woman named Clara Holt, who has been there for 4 months, and who has the signed correspondence between you and Recorder Aldous about the Pruitt boundary adjustment. She paused. That one's the worst for you, I think. It's in your handwriting, and Aldous kept copies because he was afraid of you and wanted insurance. The silence that followed lasted long enough that one of Strake's men shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking loud in the canyon quiet. Strake's face was doing something she hadn't seen it do in 4 years of watching him operate. He was afraid. Not the reactive fear of a man in immediate physical danger, the deeper, colder fear of a man watching the architecture of everything he'd built begin to crack along lines he hadn't known were there. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice had changed by a fraction. I might be, she said, but you'd have to take that chance. And the cost of being wrong is the rest of your life in a federal prison. She looked at him. Is it a bluff? It wasn't. But she let the question sit. From inside the station, the door to the interior room opened, and Brenner Vane came through it, walking backwards with his hands visible, and a guard's revolver following him. Then he stepped to the side, and the guard came through after him, and then 2 other men came through, and the situation in the doorway went from complicated to significantly worse in about 4 seconds. Vane caught her eye. He was unhurt. He looked at Strake, at the 4 mounted men, at Eliza, and she could see him doing the same arithmetic. She'd done the same count of how many guns there were and how many there weren't. Vane, Strake said, without looking away from Eliza. Your friend went to a great deal of trouble tonight. She generally does, Vane said. The surveyor's is gone, one of the station guards said to Strake. The back room's empty. The rear access, he stopped. Looked at Eliza with an expression of reluctant recalibration. Someone pulled the maintenance cap on the drainage crawl. Strake looked at Eliza, at her scraped hands, at the knees of her dress, which were not in the condition they'd been in at the start of the evening. You went through the crawl, he said. Yes. Something moved through his face, something she recognized because she'd seen versions of it from other men at other moments. The specific look of someone who'd built a worldview around a false premise and is in the process of discovering the falseness. He'd spent years seeing her body and deciding what it meant. He was revising now, and the revision was coming with the particular violence of a correction that should have been made a long time ago. Take them, he said. Vane moved at the same moment. Strake spoke not toward Strake's men, but sideways, getting himself out of the direct line between the station door and the canyon floor, putting Stone behind him. Eliza moved too, backward and left, keeping Strake between herself and the mounted men. Strake, she said, loud enough to carry. The documents are already on their way to Yuma. Tonight. 2 men who know the route and know what they're carrying. She stopped moving. What happens to us in this canyon doesn't change that. It only adds to what gets put in front of a judge. Strake raised a hand. His men stopped. The canyon was quiet except for the thin sound of water in the channel and horses breathing. You're telling me it's already over, Strake said. I'm telling you that what happens next is either the end of something or the end of something worse. She looked at him with a directness she'd been building toward for 4 months. Through all the nights of memorizing names and numbers in an empty house, through the morning on the wagon with the rope around her neck, through the crawl in the dark on her hands and knees. You can add murdering 2 more people to the evidence that's riding south right now, or you can let us walk out of this canyon. And if I let you walk, you still face what Caleb built. But you face it as a man who didn't make it worse in the final hour. She paused. That's the only offer I have. I know it's not a good one, but it's the one that exists. Strake looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at his men, at Vane, at the canyon walls rising above them and the dark sky above the walls and the vast indifferent territory beyond. You think a federal court is going to... He started. Yes, she said simply. I do. Another silence. Strake turned his horse. He did it slowly, with the controlled deliberateness of a man managing his own rage, and he spoke without turning back. Cord, we're going to dry mercy. Cord Fulser, who had ridden with Strake's group and whose jaw showed the memory of Vane's palm from the morning, looked between his employer and the two people standing in the canyon and appeared to make a calculation of his own. He turned his horse. The other men followed, one by one, until the canyon was empty of everyone except Eliza and Vane, and the lamplight from the station door, and the sound of hooves on stone diminishing northward. Vane stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Dry Mercy," he said finally. "He's going to the land office." Yes. She was already thinking about it. He'll try to destroy the official records before the territorial investigators can compare them against Caleb's evidence. How long does he have? Pruitt and Reed are riding south at full speed. The territorial office in Yuma is 12 hours, maybe more. She looked north, in the direction Strake had gone. Dry Mercy is 5 hours from here at a hard ride. We have no horses. Pruitt left one. He told me there's a hobbled horse at the draw we used coming in. She turned toward the south end of the canyon. "One horse for 2 people. I'll run the first mile," Vane said. She looked at him. "I've done it before," he said. "Stop looking at me like that." They went south through the canyon at a pace that was faster than careful and slower than reckless. And at the draw they found the horse Pruitt had left a solid bay mare that looked at them with the mild suspicion of a horse asked to carry double at an unreasonable hour. Vane ran the first mile, as he'd said, and then they rode double with Eliza behind because her knowledge of the terrain meant she needed to be able to see forward and direct, and Vane accepted this without discussion. The ride back toward Dry Mercy was punishing in the way of all necessary things. The bay was willing but not fast under double weight, and the miles went by with the particular grudgingness of miles that matter. Eliza's hands on Vane's coat were not as steady as she'd have liked, and she noticed this and filed it away as a thing to deal with when there was time, which wasn't now. "The letter," Vane said, "somewhere in the second hour of riding." "You still have it?" "Yes." "You could have given it to him." "No," she said, "I couldn't have, even if I'd wanted to. Even if it would have gotten us both out of that canyon without any of the rest of it." She felt him understand this without her explaining further. The letter was Caleb's. It existed because Caleb had trusted Vane, had trusted that Vane would come, had put his faith in the fact that some things don't expire. Handing it to Harlan Strake wasn't possible. It was simply not a thing that could be done. They reached the outskirts of Dry Mercy when the sky was going from black to the dark gray blue of pre-dawn, the hour when the stars have started to step back, but the light hasn't yet committed to anything. The town was quiet with the specific silence of a place that doesn't know yet what's about to happen in it. The land office was on the main street, 2 buildings down from the bank. Eliza knew it the way she knew every building in Dry Mercy, its hours, its procedures, its registry books arranged in order by township on shelves that ran the full length of the south wall. Caleb had spent more time in that building than almost anywhere else, cross-referencing Strake's claims against the official registry and finding the discrepancies. She could see light in the window when they came down the freight road. "He's already there," she said. They left the horse at the alley entrance and went on foot. The land office front door was locked, but the lock had been forced, the frame was splintered inward, the door hanging slightly open, and light from a lamp inside, moving in the unsteady way that said someone was carrying it rather than leaving it stationary. Vane put his hand on the door and looked at her. She nodded. They went in. Strake was at the back wall with a lamp in one hand and a thick ledger in his other hand, tilting the lamp toward the ledger in the way of a man who's looking for a specific page. He'd ridden harder than they had, or taken a route that cut time, and he'd been here long enough to have already pulled 3 or 4 ledgers off the shelf and discarded them on the floor. 2 of his men were there, not Fulser, 2 others, positioned near the front window and the rear door. They saw Vane and moved. Vane went to the right. One man met him, and the engagement was brief and loud and not elegant furniture overturned. The sound of someone's head finding the edge of a desk, and then that man was on the floor, and Vane was bleeding from a cut somewhere on his face that he ignored. The second man came at Eliza. She didn't back up. She did the thing that years of being underestimated had quietly prepared her, for she stood her ground in a way that the man clearly didn't expect. And when he grabbed for her arm, she twisted in the direction of the grab rather than against it and used her weight to her advantage, in a way that dropped them both sideways into the shelving. The shelving was bolted to the wall and didn't move, but the man's shoulder hit it at a wrong angle, and he made a sound and his grip loosened, and that was enough. She got past him and put herself between Strake and the ledger shelves. Strake looked at her. He was holding the lamp close to the ledger pages. She could see what he was looking at: the township registry for the Black Canyon area, which contained the official record of Pruitt's boundary claim and the notation that Strake's surveyors had altered. "Put it down," she said. "This is my office," Strake said. "This county is my county. Not after tonight." He looked at the lamp. She looked at the lamp. They both knew what the next 5 seconds could look like: a lamp over paper, in a room full of paper, and every record of every land transaction in this county going up in a fire that could be called an accident. Strake, Vane's voice from behind her, steady in the way it was always steady. "There are people outside." There were. Eliza hadn't heard them arriving. She'd been focused on the lamp, but now she could hear it. Boots on the boardwalk. A voice she recognized as Olin Pitts, saying something to someone. Another voice, more than one. Strake heard it too. The lamp in his hand trembled slightly, not from emotion, from the physical tension of holding it at that angle for that long, while his mind ran through options that were closing faster than he could reach them. She could see it happening. She'd watched him for 4 years, and she understood his patterns. And the pattern she was watching now was the pattern of a man who operated on the assumption of control and was experiencing the particular crisis that comes when control becomes unavailable. Every person Strake cheated every family that lost land to a fraudulent claim they all have documents, she said. Whatever you destroy tonight, whatever you manage to burn or lose or alter, there are copies. You taught this county what documentation is worth, Mr. Strake. You taught them by taking everything from people who didn't have it. And while you were doing that, Caleb was teaching them what to do with it. She looked at him steadily. The records this room has are important, but they're not the only records. And the people outside this window have been holding their copies for years because they didn't know if anyone would ever come along who could do something with them. The sound outside was growing. Not a mob, not the ugly, frightened sound of a crowd pushed into violence. Something different. People arriving with a specific purpose. The sound of people who'd been waiting for something and had decided that the wait was over. Strake's second man had gotten up from where Vane had put him and was standing near the rear door with the particular posture of someone reevaluating his employment. He looked at Strake. He looked at the front window, where lamplight moving past meant more people were gathering on the boardwalk. He looked at the lamp in Strake's hand. He opened the rear door and walked out. Strake watched him go. The lamp shook again in his hand. "I built this town," he said. His voice was different now. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that was new, the specific flatness of a man who's dropped the performance and is speaking from whatever is actually underneath it. "Everything here that's worth anything, the freight road, the bank, the water rights, I built it." "You took it," Eliza said. "That's not the same. It's the same in a frontier county. You take what you can hold, and you hold it against whoever wants it back." He was looking at her now with a strange kind of intensity, the look of a man trying to make someone understand something he himself has always taken as self-evident. "Your husband didn't understand that either. That's what killed him. He thought there were rules." "There are rules," she said. "He just understood them better than you." Something shifted in Strake's face. Not softening, the opposite of softening. The closing down of a man who's reached the end of something and knows it. He set the ledger down on the desk beside him. He did not set down the lamp. "Strake," Vane's voice was quiet and direct, "don't." Strake looked at the lamp, at the ledger on the desk beside him, at the shelves of records behind Eliza. The front door opened. Olin Pitts came in first, which was unexpected. He was in his coat and boots and holding a lamp of his own, and behind him were 3 other people: a man Eliza recognized as one of the families Strake had foreclosed, and a woman she didn't know, and behind them Ada Carver with her shotgun under her arm, and an expression that suggested she'd walked here from the boarding house, and the walk had not improved her temperament. Strake looked at them. They looked back. The moment was not dramatic in the way she might have imagined it. There was no speech, no confrontation that would satisfy a storyteller. It was quieter than that. The quiet of a room where everyone present can see exactly where things stand, and the standing is unambiguous, and there's nothing left to argue about. Strake set the lamp on the desk. He stepped back from the ledger. His remaining man, who'd been watching from near the front window, let his hand drop away from his revolver. Vane crossed the room and picked up the lamp and moved it away from the paper. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Strake pulled out a chair and sat down in it, and the sitting was the thing that told Eliza it was over the particular way a man sits when he's done running the race and knows the result and is simply waiting for what comes next. "There's going to be a reckoning," Pitts said. His voice was not strong, but it was there, which was more than he'd managed in the square 24 hours ago. The territorial sheriff's office was contacted 2 hours ago. Messenger left on the night road. "How?" Vane asked. "Josiah Reed's sister-in-law." Pitts looked vaguely embarrassed. "When Reed didn't come back, she went to find him and couldn't. She knew enough to go to the right place." Eliza made a mental note to find out the sister-in-law's name. The room was getting crowded. People had come in from the boardwalk carefully, not rushing, but steadily. Ranchers she recognized. The schoolteacher, Mrs. Craddock, who was carrying a folder of documents pressed against her chest with both arms. 2 of the miners from the square yesterday morning. People who'd been awake, she realized, or who'd been gotten up and told to come, who'd been waiting for something to move toward. Ada Carver positioned herself near the door with her shotgun and said nothing to anyone. She didn't need to. The sheriff, Vane said to Eliza quietly. Strake's sheriff. She'd been thinking about him. He'll have heard by now that something went wrong at Black Canyon. He'll be trying to figure out which way the wind is blowing before he commits. She looked at the room. We need to get to the records office before he decides the wind is blowing toward burning things. The records office, the official county records building, separate from the land office, was 4 buildings south. Eliza knew the layout, the main ledger room, the deed vault, the correspondence files that went back 15 years. All of it represented the official version of everything Strake had done. And the official version contained the alterations in the fraudulent entries and the evidence of what the real version had been before it was changed. She looked at Ada. Can you hold this room? Ada looked at Strake, at his remaining man, at the people crowding in from the boardwalk. Nobody's going anywhere they're not supposed to, she said. Pitts. Eliza turned to him. The ledgers on that desk, don't let anyone near them. And if Strake's sheriff shows up, you tell him the territorial office has already been contacted, and any action he takes in the next few hours is going to be examined very carefully. Pitts straightened slightly. It was a small thing, but she noticed it the posture of a man who'd been told specifically what his role was, and found that having a specific role was easier than having no role at all. Understood. She went to the door. Vane was beside her. Records office, he said. Records office, she agreed. They went out onto the boardwalk, and the dawn was beginning in earnest, now the sky going from dark blue to a pale steel gray that showed the outlines of buildings and the faces of the people in the street. There were more people in the street than she expected. Not the crowd that had gathered for the hanging. This was different, smaller. People who'd heard something in the night and gotten up and come to see what was happening and were standing in uncertain clusters on the boardwalk and in the street. She recognized faces. She knew most of them. Some of them had been at the square yesterday morning. Eliza. A woman's voice from the edge of the boardwalk, one of the rancher families. A woman she knew had lost grazing land to Strake's water rights scheme 18 months ago. Is it true about Quill, about the evidence? It's true, Eliza said. We need the records office secured. Will you help? The woman looked at her, looked at Vane, looked at the people around her. Tell me what you need, she said. They went to the records office in a group of 7, Eliza and Vane, and 5 people from the street who asked no further questions and needed none. The building was locked and dark when they arrived, which was what she'd hoped the sheriff hadn't gotten here first. She sent 2 people to watch the street approaches and used Pitts's key ring, which she'd taken because Pitts managed keys for half the buildings on the main street, to work through the options until she found one that fit. The lock opened. They went in. Eliza went directly to the correspondence files. The main ledgers could be reconstructed from copies if they had to be the copies that Caleb had distributed, the documents that Quill and Reed and Pruitt and Ada had been holding, were sufficient to prove the alterations. But the correspondence files contained the original letters, the communication between Strake and the various officials he'd bought, the paper trail of a decade of corruption in its own handwriting. She found the file drawer she needed, the one labeled with the Territorial Recorder's Office, the correspondence going back 7 years, and she pulled the drawer, and it was full, everything intact, nothing removed. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Here," she said, to the woman who'd come with them, the rancher's wife, whose name was Marta Hollis, and who turned out to have strong hands and the organizational instincts of someone who'd managed a household and a working ranch simultaneously for 20 years. "These are what matters most. We need them in a secure location until the territorial investigators arrive. My brother has a fireproof safe at the assay office," Marta said. "Left over from when the mine was operating. Nobody's touched it in 3 years." "Get them there," Eliza said. Marta started pulling files. Vane was at the window. "Sheriff just came out of the jail," he said quietly. "He's looking this direction. How many men with him?" "2. She thought about the sheriff, a man named Carlos, who'd held the badge for 6 years on Strake's patronage, and had the deeply unhappy look of someone who understood by now that the patronage was ending. She'd watched him carefully in the square yesterday morning, when the rope was around her neck, and what she'd seen was not a man who wanted to be there. A man who was doing what the situation required of him, because the situation had been defined by Strake, and Strake's definition of situations was the only one that had ever mattered. That definition was no longer operative. "I'll talk to him," she said. Vane turned from the window. "Eliza, he's afraid," she said. "Not loyal. There's a difference." She looked at Vane directly. "I've been watching the people in this town for 4 years, trying to figure out who's loyal to Strake because they believe in him and who's loyal because they're scared. Carlos is scared, and scared men, when the thing they're scared of starts looking less inevitable, will move faster than you expect." Vane studied her for a moment. Then he stepped away from the window. "I'll be right here." She went out. Sheriff Carlos was a medium-built man in his 50s who'd added weight in the wrong places over the years and wore his badge the way some men wore hats out of habit more than intention. He stopped when he saw her come out of the records office, and the 2 men with him stopped behind him, and nobody reached for anything, which she took as a reasonable sign. "Mrs. Harland," he said. "Sheriff." She came off the boardwalk step and stood in the street so they were level. "I expect you've had a long night." He looked at the records office, at the people moving behind the window. "What's being done in there?" "County correspondence files are being moved to a secured location pending arrival of territorial investigators." She met his eyes. "Everything is being documented. What moves, who moves it, where it goes. Every ledger, every letter, every deed." She paused. "Which means every person who makes a decision in the next few hours will have that decision on the record." Carlos's jaw moved. "Strake is in the land office with Ada Carver's shotgun nearby and about 30 people who have decided that 4 years of silence was enough." She kept her voice even. "The territorial sheriff's office received a messenger 2 hours ago. There will be investigators in Dry Mercy within a day, possibly less." One of the 2 men behind Carlos took a step back. Carlos noticed. His eyes went to the man and came back to Eliza. "What are you asking me to do?" he said. His voice was flat with the specific flatness of a man who's already made a private decision and is waiting to see whether the public decision is going to match it. "I'm asking you to let us secure those records and make sure nobody interferes with that process." She looked at him steadily. "That's all. I'm not asking you to do anything that looks like what it actually is. I'm asking you to maintain order, which is your job." Carlos looked at his remaining man, at the records office, at the pale sky above the buildings getting lighter by the minute. He reached up and unpinned his badge. He held it for a second, looking at it. Then he put it in his shirt pocket. "I'm going home," he said. "I'm going to stay there until someone official tells me otherwise." He looked at Eliza. "The jail keys are on a hook behind my desk. Left side." He looked at her for another moment, and there was something in his face that wasn't quite an apology, and wasn't quite a statement, but was somewhere between the two. "Caleb Harland was a decent man, yes," she said. "He was." Carlos walked away. His remaining man walked with him, and they went down the main street and turned at the corner, and that was the last she saw of either of them that morning. She stood in the street for a moment. The sky was properly light now. Not sunrise that was still a few minutes away, but light enough to see the square, which was filling with people in the particular way of a town on a morning when something has shifted, and everyone can feel it, but nobody is quite sure yet what shape it's taken. People on boardwalks, people in doorways, people moving with a different kind of energy than they'd had 24 hours ago when they'd stood in this same square and watched 5 armed men around a wagon. Vane came out of the records office. He stood beside her. "Marta's got the files moving," he said. "The assay office safe is apparently large enough, and the brother has the combination." "Good. Strake hasn't moved from the land office." "He won't. Not now." She watched the square. "He's not that kind of man. He'll wait for a legal process, because that's the arena he's controlled for 11 years, and even now it's the one he understands best." Vane looked at her sideways. "You understand him very well." "I've had reason to." She looked at the square. The wagon was gone. Someone had moved it after the morning's events, and where it had stood there was just the usual packed earth of the square, worn and ordinary. 4 years of watching someone who doesn't know he's being watched. It leaves a mark. What does it leave? She thought about it. Knowledge, she said finally, just knowledge of how he thinks, how he reacts, where the gaps are in what he believes he's controlled. She looked at Vane. It's not satisfying knowledge. It's not the kind of thing that feels good to have. It just turns out to be useful. From the south end of the main street, a sound horses again, but this time the sound of a larger group, moving at a controlled trot. Not Strake's people. The pace was wrong, too disciplined, too even. Eliza turned. 4 riders in the gray dawn light coming in from the freight road. Official-looking in the way of men who'd been given specific authority and were carrying it visibly. One of them carried a leather document bag across his saddle horn. They weren't the territorial investigators, it was too soon for that. But behind them, on a borrowed horse that showed every one of its 12 miles, was Devlin Pruitt. And beside Pruitt, wrapped in someone's extra coat and riding with the careful posture of a man whose joints had been through an experience they were still processing, was Silas Quill. He'd made it. Eliza put her hand on the hitching post next to her and held it for a moment. Just held it. They sent riders ahead, Vane said. Pruitt must have found someone with authority closer than Yuma. The sub-office, Eliza said. There's a territorial land office substation in Maricopa Wells. About 6 hours southeast. She watched the riders come up the main street. Watched Pruitt look around the square and find her and raise a hand. Watched Quill look at the buildings of Dry Mercy with the squinting assessment of a man seeing a place he'd heard a great deal about and finding it smaller than he expected. 6 hours if you're riding hard and you know why it matters. The riders pulled up in the square. The man with the document bag looked at the land office and then looked at Eliza because she was standing in the street and clearly waiting and clearly not frightened. "I'm looking for a Mrs. Harland," he said. "That's me," she said. He swung down, held out a hand. "Deputy Territorial Commissioner Ames, out of Maricopa Wells. We received a report last night about a situation in Dry Mercy." "The situation is ongoing," she said. "Harlan Strake is in the land office, 4 buildings north. He came there to destroy records, and he didn't succeed, and the records are now secured." She met the commissioner's eyes. "I have consolidated evidence from multiple sources and a witness who can explain the full scope of the land fraud. When do you want to start?" Commissioner Ames looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who'd ridden hard through the night expecting chaos and had arrived to find something considerably more organized than expected. "Now," he said. "We start now." Eliza turned and walked toward the land office, and behind her she heard Quill's horse being helped to a stop, and Quill's voice saying something to Pruitt in the tone of a man reporting the completion of a task. And ahead of her, the door of the land office was opening from inside, and the early light was catching the edges of buildings, and the square was full of people who'd spent years looking at the ground, and were finding it easier this morning to look up. She didn't look back. The territorial investigation took 4 months. That was the part nobody talked about afterward, the 4 months of paperwork and depositions and legal arguments, and the slow, grinding work of proving in formal language what everyone in Dry Mercy had known informally for years. Silas Quill testified for 3 days before the Territorial Commission, sitting in a straight-back chair with his swollen eye long since healed, and his two-fingered hand resting on the table, explaining boundary surveys and falsified records with the patient precision of a man who'd spent 40 years, making sure measurements were correct and took the corruption of that work as a personal affront. Josiah Reed testified about the mine shipment records. Ada Carver testified about what she'd witnessed and kept. Devlin Pruitt testified about his land. Eliza Harland testified for 5 days. She brought numbers. She brought names. She brought 4 months of memory, organized into a documented account that the Territorial Commissioners later described, in their formal report, as the most comprehensive private record of systematic fraud they had encountered in 15 years of territorial law. Clara Holt came back from Tucson with the signed correspondence between Strake and Recorder Aldous. That correspondence, in Strake's own handwriting, was what the prosecuting attorneys later called the clearest proof of deliberate criminal intent they had seen in a land fraud case. Harlan Strake was convicted on 11 counts. The corrupt recorder, 2 deputy sheriffs, and a territorial land assessor were convicted alongside him. Sheriff Carlos, who had unpinned his badge and gone home and cooperated fully with investigators afterward, received a formal censure and a fine and lost his position. It was less than he deserved and more than he'd expected, and he left Dry Mercy the following spring and didn't come back. Stolen land went back to the families who could prove original ownership, not all of them, because some records were too damaged and some chains of title too tangled to resolve cleanly, and the law moved at the speed the law moves at, which is never as fast as the people waiting for it would prefer. Devlin Pruitt got his grazing land back. The family whose homestead Eliza and Vane had sheltered in got their deed restored. A dozen other families received varying degrees of restitution from the liquidation of Strake's remaining assets. It wasn't perfect. It was never going to be perfect. Some people had lost years they weren't getting back. Some had lost family members who died in the lean years that Strake's fraud had caused. The law could return a deed. It could not return a father, or a year of a child's childhood spent hungry, or the particular damage that comes from watching injustice operate openly and feeling powerless against it. Eliza knew that. She didn't pretend otherwise. What the law could do, it did. And that, she had decided somewhere in the long months of testimony and waiting, was worth fighting for even when it wasn't enough. Because the alternative, a world where Harlan Strake was simply never challenged at all, was worse in a way that didn't require argument. Caleb had known that. It was why he'd worked, and why he'd died working, and why she'd kept working after him. She opened the claims and bookkeeping office in Caleb's old space above the freight company in the spring, following the convictions. She repainted the door. She left Caleb's name on it alongside her own, partly because he'd earned the right to have his name on the work that came from his work, and partly because she wasn't sentimental in most directions, but she was sentimental in this one, and she'd decided that was allowable. Ranchers came, miners came, widows came with contracts their late husbands had signed, and they wanted to know what the contracts actually said. Laborers came with wage agreements they didn't fully understand. She read everything carefully and explained it in plain language and charged a modest fee that she occasionally declined to charge when the person across the desk from her clearly couldn't afford it. Vane stayed. He stayed for the investigation, which he'd said he would. And then he stayed after, which he hadn't said he would, and didn't make a particular announcement about. He simply kept being present, kept showing up at the freight office or at Ada Carver's, where Eliza ate dinner twice a week, kept being the kind of company that didn't require explanation or management. He picked up occasional work, tracking 2 remaining fugitives from Strake's operation who'd scattered when the arrests started. He was useful with his hands in the practical way of a man who'd spent decades solving problems with whatever was available. He was not easy company exactly. He was quiet in ways that occasionally felt like distance and occasionally felt like respect, and Eliza was never fully sure which it was until she'd known him long enough to understand. It was usually both simultaneously. He made bad coffee and was unapologetic about it. He had a temper that he managed, but didn't always manage perfectly, and twice he said things that required an apology, and he gave the apology without drama and without excessive self-flagellation. which she found more reassuring than a man who never lost his temper would have been. He was real. That was the thing. After 4 years of watching Harlan Strake perform power and a lifetime of watching men perform their assessments of who she was and what she was worth, a man who was simply real felt like something she hadn't known she'd been waiting for. They married the following autumn. It was not a large event. Ada Carver was there, and Silas Quill, and Devlin Pruitt, and Marta Hollis and her family, and Josiah Reed, who'd brought his wife and children back from Tucson in the spring. Olin Pitts was there. He'd become, in the intervening months, one of the more useful members of the loose coalition of people who'd decided that Dry Mercy was worth rebuilding into something better than it had been, which was the kind of redemption that doesn't happen in a single dramatic moment, but accumulates in small decisions made over time. The old Gallows came down that winter. The timber was good solid, well-joined, and it seemed wrong to burn it when there were better uses for the wood. It was Eliza's suggestion that it become benches for the courthouse. The courthouse had been rebuilt as part of the territorial effort to establish a real legal presence in Dry Mercy, and its square was bare and needed seating. And the irony of the Gallows timber becoming a place where people sat to wait for justice felt appropriate in the way that hard-earned things sometimes feel appropriate. Not comfortable, not entirely peaceful, just right. There is something people get wrong about stories like this one. They imagine that when the villain is convicted, and the land is returned, and the corrupt officials are removed, the people who survived it feel triumphant. Clean, resolved. That wasn't what Eliza felt. What she felt mostly was tired in a specific way that took a long time to lift. And underneath the tiredness, when it did lift, was something quieter and more durable, the knowledge that she had done what could be done with what she had. And that the doing of it had required her to discover things about herself she hadn't known she had. Stubbornness, yes. Memory, yes. But also the specific courage of being willing to act in the absence of any guarantee that the action would work. She thought about that sometimes, sitting at the desk in the office above the freight company with someone's contract in front of her and the sounds of Dry Mercy going about its ordinary business below. She thought about the fact that Caleb had trusted her when he wrote her name in that letter, not trust her to be rescued, but trusted her to know what to do. And she thought about the fact that he'd been right, not because she was extraordinary, but because he'd known her well enough to understand that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you start to believe the people doing the underestimating. She never did. That was the thing in the end, the simplest and the most important thing. All those years of mockery and dismissal and the easy cruelty of people who decided what she was worth based on how she looked, none of it had touched the part of her that actually mattered. Not because she was immune to it, because she'd had enough in herself to hold on to when other people's judgment tried to take it away. Nobody in Dry Mercy laughed at her anymore. She noticed that. She also noticed that she didn't need it, which felt better than she expected. The office had good light in the afternoons, when the sun came in from the west and made the desk warm and the dust in the air visible, and the whole space feel inhabited in a way that empty spaces never do. Brenner Vane sometimes came in at the end of the day and sat in the chair that had replaced the broken three-legged one, and read or didn't, and she worked or didn't. And the silence between them was the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Caleb's name was still on the door. Outside, Dry Mercy went on imperfectly, incompletely, carrying its history the way all places carry history, visible in the benches outside the courthouse and the restored deeds on the walls of ranches that had once nearly been lost, and in the fact that there was a woman above the freight company who would read your contract before you signed it and tell you plainly what it said. It wasn't a perfect town. It never had been. But it was one where a person who knew what they were doing could stand in the square and not be afraid of what was standing next to them. That was enough. That was Eliza had come to understand exactly enough.